Good afternoon. Good afternoon. All right, thank you. Thank you all for being here. My name is Dr. Couch, and I work here in the Office of Financial Aid. I'm at Community College, Central Indiana. And a couple housekeeping things really quick. So we have bathrooms to the east and to the west. So there's bathrooms on this side, and there's bathrooms on that side. If you gotta go to the bathroom, you do not have to raise your hand. Feel free to go. We are one of those loose places, so go as you need to. A couple of things, I'm going to give some quick highlights of his bio. There's also a longer bio on the table, and then we'll jump right in. So, Tim Wise is among the most prominent anti-racist writers and educators in the United States. He has spent the past 26 years speaking to audiences in all 50 states on over 1,000 college and high school campuses, at hundreds of professional and academic conferences, and to community groups across the country. He is also the host of the new podcast, Speak Out with Tim Wise. Wise is the author of 7 books, including his latest, Under the Influence, Shaming the Poor, Praising the Rich, and Sacrificing the Future of America, and his highly acclaimed memoir, White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. Wise appears regularly on CNN and MSNBC to discuss race issues. It was featured in a 2007 segment on 2020. He graduated from Tulane University in 1990 and received anti-racism training from the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond in New Orleans. Friends, folks, please join me in welcoming Mr. Tim Wise.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to start off, I'm going to say something I said earlier for those of you, there were some of you in the room for the workshop that we did, the professional development opportunity that we did from 9 to 12 this morning. There will be some repetitive stuff. You know, when you got some decent stuff, you want to say it 2 or 3 times, just make sure folks got it. The rest of y'all weren't there. So let me start off by saying this. It's going to sound weird, but there's a point to what I'm about to say. I'm going to let y'all know that for the last year and a half, I have been in therapy, and I'm supposed to tell you that because my therapist says that it's therapeutic. So there. So I've got it out. Now, the reason I'm telling you about being in therapy, number one, this is not a Talkspace commercial, but if you are interested, you ought to do it because y'all are damaged just like me. The difference is I know my damage, and some of y'all are still in denial about yours. So get clear on that because we have all been raised in dysfunction. And the dysfunction has an effect on the adult that you become. And that is true not only of individuals, that is true of entire societies, which is why I'm telling you that at the outset of the presentation. Because individually, it's not hard for you to hear that, right? To get your head around that. The idea that yes, our drama and our trauma affects the person that we become. A lot of that rooted in childhood, some of it maybe last week. But the point is that our past affects our present. And we know that about ourselves, or at least we should. And when I say it, it's not controversial. But if it's true for me individually, and it's true for you individually, you multiply that out by 335 million people, and you start to recognize that it isn't just our individual past that affects our present, right? That it's our collective past that affects our present. That inertia, contrary to maybe the way we were taught about it, isn't just a physical property. Second Law of Thermodynamics, which says what? That an object in motion tends to remain in motion, isn't just a property of the physical universe. It's a socioeconomic property. It's a political property. It's a cultural property, right? The things that happen in one generation affects the next generation and the next generation and the next generation until that effect is interrupted by a force of equal or greater power pushing against it. We are potentially that power, but I say potentially because we're here 400 years into this colonial project known as the United States of America now, and we still haven't quite figured it out. So I want us to think about how the past affects the present, and particularly, I want us to think about how we're all products of our learning. It's a good thing to think about in an educational space. How we are products of our learning, the things that we're taught and the things that we're not taught. Some of the stuff we're taught that isn't quite right, and some of the stuff we're not taught that we should have been taught, because not knowing it can end up being a little dangerous. We are all products of our learning. Marginalized communities in this or any other society are certainly products of their learning. Those who have been denied access historically to full and equal opportunity will be taught something about themselves. And they will often come to internalize that which they are taught about themselves. Trauma doesn't just affect the traumatized, it is literally passed down intergenerationally. Now that may sound a bit absurd, but it's now something we can prove scientifically. Many years ago, some researchers at Emory University and other places started doing this research on lab mice to test the notion of intergenerational transmission of trauma. Right? The idea that your trauma doesn't just stick with you, but it can literally be passed down at the biological or even genomic level to your offspring and the offspring of your offspring. They took mice, as they often do, putting aside the ethics of animal experimentation, different lecture for a different day. Putting that aside, they took mice, and no mice were hurt in the example that I'm going to use here. Well, they were hurt, but not me talking about it, actually. The mice were put into a cage, and for a matter of several days, they were subjected to mild electric shock, but always after a certain smell was pumped into the cage that they were in. The smell of lavender or almonds or something, I can't remember exactly. But they would pump in the smell of lavender, and then immediately thereafter there'd be a mild shock on the feet of the mice, and of course it would do what? It would produce a startled response and a jump response. And after a while, they had done it so many times, won't surprise you, that whenever they would pump in the smell of the lavender, right, the mice would just jump even if you didn't shock them, because they were anticipating the jump, right? There was an extent to which that trauma had been internalized, and now they sort of anticipated harm. Now that's not surprising, right? If I shock your feet enough and you smell something, and then after a while you're going to just respond that way whenever you smell it. But here's what they did. They then proceeded to breed these mice. And so the mice had I don't know how long the gestation period for a mouse is, but they bred the mice had mice, then the mice's mice had mice, so now we're at the grand mice of the original mice. And the grand mice, or the original mice who had been shocked after the smell of lavender, were then put in a cage. And they too were subjected to the scent, but not the shock. They were never shocked. And yet, 2 generations removed from the original experiment, when they smelled the lavender, they jumped. They responded with a startled response. In other words, this is what's called epigenetic memory. This is something that is being passed down at the biological level. We don't know exactly what the mechanism is, but we know that there is no reason why this second generation out group of mice should have responded in that way, except that there is a trauma created in just a matter of days or weeks that is being transmitted to them. Now, I want you to think about how that could, and then how it does, in fact, apply to human beings. It used to be that indigenous peoples in the Americas would talk about the soul wound of colonialism, and they would talk about the way that many generations removed from land theft, many generations removed from the boarding schools, many generations removed from forced adoptions, where indigenous people were literally confiscated from their communities and given out to white families to raise them and break them, and change them from whom they had been. Many generations removed from that, they would talk about people having dreams, terror, nightmares about colonialism and about those things they had never experienced. And Western science said, that's not real. That's not true. You can't possibly transmit trauma through dreams. You can't transmit trauma genetically, pass it on to your children. But now we know, because of this epigenetic research that began with mice, that's not true. So we've now started doing this research on the survivors of the European Holocaust of European Jewry. But it's not just them they're studying, it's their grandchildren. Right? So folks who were in the camps and suffered tremendously, but often didn't talk about it, because a lot of survivors who were in the camps didn't tell their kids, didn't tell their grandkids. It was just too painful, so a lot of those stories were not told. But in any event, the grandchildren, those certainly were never in the camps. They never experienced the trauma. They never experienced the drama. They never experienced the pain of having been there. And yet, 2 generations removed, they're able to look at some of the stress indicators, like the levels of stress hormones in the blood. Right? The presence of certain stress hormones, the allostatic load, the extent to which the allostatic system is overloaded by stress and by the hormones related to stress. And what they're able to find is that even when you control for all the other factors that could explain elevated levels of stress hormone, all the other factors that could explain elevated blood pressure, because there are lots of them and they know what they are, they can control for them. Diet, exercise. They can control for geographic region where you live, your income, your occupational status, your education. They can control for all of those things. They're finding that the grandchildren of the camp generation, those that were in the camps during World War II, have elevated levels of all these things relative to their peers whose grandparents were not in the camps but are also Jewish. So similar experience, similar ethnicity and culture and background and family demographics, but not the experience of trauma. And it's the only thing left that can really explain the differential. Now, I want you to think about how this, if we were willing to study it with regard to people of color in this country, what we might find. Well, we know sort of what we would find. The CDC can already tell us. You know, for instance, when you do your blood pressure, right? Blood pressure is supposed to come down when you sleep. That's just sort of how the human body's system is supposed to work, right? When you sleep, when you are at rest, your blood pressure should drop. The research says that for African American folk in this country, regardless of income, regardless of occupation, regardless of educational background, right, regardless of diet and exercise and all the things that can explain elevated blood pressure, that in fact at night, at rest, black blood pressure is not dropping, it remains elevated, that those levels of stress hormones remain elevated throughout the course of their lives, even when they are college educated, with good degrees, with decent incomes, not poor. Which is to say something is going on, and it's not just happening in one generation, but it's being transmitted intergenerationally down through time. We're all products of our learning. These are communities that are learning and have been taught since the beginning of the country that they are lesser, and they are being led to believe that they are lesser in every possible way. That's why even 45% of African American folks, when they take tests for subconscious bias, implicit bias as it's called, right? 45% of black folks demonstrate implicit bias toward their own group. This is why the doll test that Kenneth and Amy Clark did in 1954 for the Brown versus Board of Education decision ultimately helped make that decision. These were sociologists who, had black children playing with dolls, asked them which dolls they'd rather play with. They said the white dolls because the white dolls were cleaner, the white dolls were smarter, white people were prettier. You might think that was a 1950s thing, but then again, CNN did it like 10 years ago. Put kids in a room, did the same thing. They did it with paper dolls, but same concept. They said, if these were real people, who would you rather play with? And they had parents behind glass, right, watching their children. Right? Parents behind glass, and they were saying to them, oh, my kid's not going to have this. My kids are colorblind. They have white parents and black parents behind the glass. And the white parents were shocked that the white kids would rather play with the white children. Right? Because we don't talk that way. We wouldn't say those things in our home. Right? Well, maybe not, but they're picking it up somewhere. And then the black kids were doing the same thing. This is long after the original doll test, saying the same thing. I'd rather play with this child because this child is nicer. This child is prettier. This child is smarter. Right? This other child, the one that looks sort of like me, this child is less intelligent. This child is less beautiful. This child is dirty, or whatever various stereotypes. So we're all products of our learning, and there's an awful lot of negative learning still going on, imposing a form of post-traumatic stress on those who have been the targets of it. But I also want to suggest that this society sends a lot of messages to the dominant group, right, that are just as toxic and poisonous, right? Maybe more so in some regards because it keeps things in place. If you talk about the intergenerational transmission of trauma, that's what the epigenetic research I just mentioned is. Let me ask you a question. If the targeted group, if the marginalized group is having intergenerational trauma, what's the dominant group getting? What are they getting in a society? Do they have something transmitted intergenerationally as well? What are we being taught, and how does that get passed down? Not just directly, like in the classroom, whether that's a real classroom or the place where you live, which ends up being sort of an informal classroom because our parents are our first teachers typically, right? But what else is being transmitted? Let me tell you a couple stories to give you an idea of what I think is being transmitted and how deep it runs so we can understand the depth of the problem here. So 2 stories. First story is about my grandmother, my dad's mom. Been dead for 21 years. This past August, died about 2 weeks before my wife and I were married in September of 1988. And she was a really instrumental person in my life, like really incredibly important in pretty much keeping me alive, emotionally, if not physically. It was her house, hers and my grandfather's, that I would turn whenever things got a little tight in my home, which, given that I've already told you I'm in therapy, they did. So when the drama and the trauma was a little too much for me to bear, that's where I would go. That would be my escape valve, would be to go to their house. So she was really important in just raising me, but she was also very important in the way that I came to understand the stuff I talk about now, race. She was very committed to challenging racism whenever she observed it. Now, she wasn't an activist. I don't want to give the false impression that she was out marching. She was not. she was someone who was very clear on a personal level of the unacceptability of racism, and she had learned and come to understand the unacceptability of it growing up in her father's home. Her father, my great-grandfather, who was a member of the Klan. First in Tennessee, then in Michigan, which used to have one of the strongest Klans, along with Indiana in the 1920s in the United States, right? And then back in Tennessee when they moved back there from Michigan in the 1920s. My grandmother, who always was offended and despised his racism, came to a point where she couldn't abide it anymore. That point was when she, at the age of 16, fell in love with the man who would become my grandfather, who was Jewish, which does not normally go over well at the Friday night Clavern meeting, in case you're all confused about that. So she falls in love with this man who's going to become my grandfather. She goes to her father one night. She confronts him. She says, "Dad, I'm in love with Leo Wise, and here's the thing. I'm going to give you two choices tonight. Choice number one, you're going to take your robes and your hood out of the closet. You're going to take them into the front yard, and you're going to burn them. Or choice number two, I am going to take your robes and your hood out of the closet into the front yard, and I am going to burn them for you." And challenged as he was in that moment by this 16-year-old freedom fighter in, I beg to remind you, 1936, at a time when little Southern girls didn't talk to Daddy that way, he did as he was told. He got his robes, he got his hood, he took them into the yard, he burned them in a bonfire. The next day he quit the Klan, changed his life, accepted the man who would become my grandfather into his family. From that point on, my grandmother thought this racism thing is easy to beat. Right? This challenging racism thing is, look at this. I told Daddy to burn his robes, and he damn well did it. Like, this is not even hard. Like, why is the system still in place? Like, just deal with them the way I dealt with Daddy. You know, that's what she's thinking. So many years later, she and my grandfather were looking for a new house, and there's a real estate agent showing them a house. And he says, "You're going to like this neighborhood. There are no black people here." Of course, he didn't say black people. My grandmother looked at him. She said, "Well, I am going to give you two choices today." Because my grandmother was a big fan of the multiple choice opportunity when it came to racism. You know, she was trying to be open-minded and ecumenical. "I'm going to give you an out. You're not going to like it, but I'm going to give you an out if you choose to take it." She said, "Number one choice, you're going to get in your car and you're going to get the hell out of here, out of my sight. Or choice number two, I'm going to get in my car and I'm going to run your ass over." That was the second choice. The real estate agent left, did as he was told, and needless to say, did not buy that house. There were many other occasions like that throughout my grandmother's life, but I didn't come here to tell you that, to praise my grandmother, you know, have you have all these warm, fuzzy feelings about this amazing woman, because there's another side to the story, which is much more important. So the last 7 or 8 years of my grandmother's life, she was suffering from and ultimately would die from symptoms related to Alzheimer's. And if you've known anyone with the disease or condition, if you have loved anyone with the disease and condition, you know a little bit about what that looks like. And one of the things that you know is that the loss of memory is like the most obvious symptom, but it's also the most benign symptom, right? It's the easiest to get your head around, and this won't make sense to you if you haven't experienced it, but in my experience, at least, the loss of memory, there was something almost oddly beautiful and romantic about it, in a twisted kind of way. Like watching a person that you love lose every recollection of who they are. There's something tragic but beautiful, and I know that doesn't make sense to you if you haven't experienced it, but trust me. So that's the benign symptom. That's the way. If that was the only symptom, it would be no big deal. Sadly, it isn't. The other symptoms are much worse. The paranoia, the rage, the insecurity, the lashing out, right? Because you do those things because it's scary. You're losing your mind, and you sort of know you're losing your mind, and you don't know who all these people are who keep poking you and prodding you and trying to get you to take this medicine and that medicine, right? She couldn't remember her family. She didn't remember what day it was. She didn't remember anything, right? And so she would lash out. She would yell at us. She would call us all kinds of choice names. She had all kinds of names for me. None of them were 10. None. And so that part was harder to get used to. Get used to the anger and the rage. And the last several years of her life, when she was being taken care of by nurses pretty much around the clock, first at home, and then in the nursing home where she lived for the last 45 days of her life before she passed, it really got bad. She would lash out at those nurses all the time. You haven't guessed by now, I should tell you that those nurses were African American women. I would ask you to ask yourself, what do you think she called them in moments of rage and anger and insecurity, keeping in mind what I just told you about who she was? And keeping in mind that she's got a disease, y'all, that takes every memory that you have and makes you forget everything. But what word do you think she never, ever forgot that you call black folks when the chips are down and you have had enough? See, she never forgot that. She couldn't feed herself. She couldn't wipe her own behind. She didn't know who her husband had been, who her kids were, what day of the week it was, what year it was, but she never forgot that. And I talked to a doctor after she finally passed about it. He said, the things that we forget last are the things that we knew best. Now, what I'm trying to tell you is not a story about Alzheimer's. It's not about Alzheimer's. It's about us. It's about how we're conditioned. Right? Because we've all had that evil planted in us by the culture. You don't have to have a clan daddy to teach you who to hate. And this society will do more than a good enough job of it. You don't have to have a clan parent. You don't have to have an overt bigot. Back in the day, the National Conference of Christians and Jews used to have this slogan, you have to be taught how to hate. I always thought that was a cop-out. First of all, it's a ripped-off line from South Pacific, so if y'all are musical theater fans, they stole the line. Right? But number two, it's just not right, because saying you have to be taught how to hate suggests you have to actually sit somebody down and teach them really clearly how to hate. Maybe my grandfather or great-grandfather tried to do that with my grandmother, but here's the thing, the vast majority of us have been taught indirectly the very same stuff. How do I know? Very simply, because the studies all say it, and I can prove it. I can go in and do a workshop and ask people, you write down every negative stereotype that you have about fill-in-the-blank group, right? What are all the stereotypes that you know? You don't have to admit that you have them, but what are the ones you know? And I've never, ever had anyone in the room go, I don't know, man, I got nothing. What do you mean? Stereotypes about black people? I can't think of one. Stereotypes about Latinx folks? What? Stereotypes about Jews? Never heard any. Stereotypes about LGBTQ folks? Can I Google it? Like, no one has ever done that, right? Because we've all been taught racial stereotypes, gender stereotypes, religious stereotypes, sexual stereotypes. And everybody will deny that they have that in them, of course, just like my grandmother would. When my grandmother was healthy, she could have fought that. She could have resisted that conditioning, however intense it was. Right? We all can resist when we're strong, but we all have moments of insecurity, don't we? We all have moments of anger. We all have moments of rage and hostility where we lash out where we're not our best selves, and it's in that moment that the conditioning comes out. And the research says that if you know what those negative stereotypes are, it doesn't take much to trigger them. It doesn't take much to trigger them. Somebody does something that reminds you of the stereotype and it sticks in your head, right? Whereas somebody else does the very same behavior, but it doesn't connect to a stereotype, you won't remember it at all. That could be a stereotype about intelligence. It could be a stereotype about criminality. Right? It could be a stereotype about who the terrorists are. 70% of all the terrorist attacks and deaths related to terrorism in the last 6 years in this country have been committed by white men on the right wing of the political spectrum, calling themselves Christian. But you know full well that's not what we have as a stereotype, therefore that's not who we treat in such a fashion. That's not because we had clan daddies that taught us that. We just learned that in the culture. Right? We've learned to make certain assumptions, and we're all products of that learning. As long as we're strong and resolute, we can resist it. But in those moments, whether it's a disease that saps your strength or it's just you had a bad day, maybe a bad week or a bad year, it becomes really easy, doesn't it, to lash out at the other and to say that they're the problem, to try to put them in their quote-unquote place. So we're all products of that. But there's also truth in the fact that we're products of the things we're not taught. Sometimes the stuff we're not taught is just as problematic as the stuff we are. Because when you're not taught certain things, you come to conclusions that lead you all astray, right? So here's the second story. My kids are, I have an 18-year-old daughter and a 16-year-old daughter. And my friend Brandon's back here thinking, holy hell, man, it's been a long time since we talked, because they were a lot younger. And they're 18 and 16-year-old daughters. So if y'all, by the way, just as a side note, if y'all are people who pray, just feel free to send one out. The oldest one's getting ready to go to college, so we need all the help we can get. I'm agnostic, so I don't even know if it'll help, but what the hell, might as well give it a shot. Think about agnostics, we're like, just do it. Like, it's not gonna hurt anything, I don't know what the outcome will be, but nobody ever died from it, so just go ahead and do it. We'll see what happens, roll the dice. Anyway, so we have an 18-year-old daughter and a 16-year-old daughter. They're both dancers and have been dancers since they were little kids, and have been in dance companies since they were quite little. And many years ago, when they were 12 and 10, I was driving them one day from their school to the dance studio downtown in Nashville, where they're at that time in that particular dance company. It's about an 8-minute drive on surface roads. Don't even have to get on the interstate, simple, easy 8-minute drive. About halfway there, we get stopped at a red light. And waiting for this light to turn green, we're looking around, and this red light happens to be in the middle of public housing. And we make this drive every day, at least 3 days a week. Not every day, 3 times a week. And have been making it for over a year, but at no point had my kids said anything about, might have noticed, but they'd never said anything about the racial makeup of the neighborhood, the demographic composition of the neighborhood. That day, a 10-year-old, who's now 16, his name is Rachel, did. She's sitting in the back seat, she says, "Daddy, why is this neighborhood pretty much all black?" And I thought, man, that is a hell of a big question. Really good. Like, I'm thinking, my 10-year-old is doing urban anthropology in the back of my Highlander. I'm like, man, let's just get you in college now, get this over with, you know. And let's be honest, I was excited because that is like the one question my kid could ask that I actually know the answer to. And there's a lot, you have to understand, my knowledge base, very narrow, deep, but very, very narrow. So if you ask me any other kind of question, not gonna know the answer. My kid says, "Daddy, where does electricity come from?" I'm gonna be like, "Aren't you studying that in science?" Because I got nothing. Or like, "You got a phone, look it up." Or I'm gonna do that thing that all parents do when we don't know the answer to the kid's question, but we don't want to admit our lack of knowledge. So you know this is like the universal sign of parental ignorance, right? It's when we say, "I don't know, what do you think?" That's our way of trying to buy time, see? She asked me about any other thing, that's going to be my answer, one of those, right? But she asked me about the racial makeup of the neighborhood. I'm like, "Daddy's got that. That is the one thing I know about." And I'm excited because I'm going to get to show my kids how brilliant I am. And when you're a parent, you will take your victories any damn place you can find them. You will not find many. So I'm ready with the answer. Now, I can't give the PhD answer to my daughter's question for a couple of reasons. Number one, I do not possess a PhD, so there's that. Number two, we got 4 minutes left. I don't have time. And number three, they're 10 and 12, y'all, so they're smart, but I mean, they can't handle the PhD answer. But I've got the thumbnail sketch, the elevator speech version. It's a long elevator ride for 4 minutes, but you know, I've got that one ready. It's right here in my throat, ready to go. I'm ready to pounce with it. And then something happened, and I didn't know it was going to happen because I'm an only child. But I found out something that day. Many of you will be able to relate. Apparently, when a younger sibling asks a question of a parent in the presence of the older sibling is just going to answer the damn question just to show off how much smarter they are than the younger, in this case, sister. And so I've got the answer. Remember the question. Rachel says, "Daddy, why is the neighborhood pretty much all black?" Daddy knows, and Daddy has the answer. But the 12-year-old, whose name is Ashton, decides it's time for her to butt in, and she does, and she says, "Redlining." And I'm like, what? For those who don't know the word, stay put. We will discuss it here in a second. I was just looking at her like, do you just know things? Like, what? Did your mother give birth to a sociological savant? How do you know what that is? The 10-year-old says, "Daddy, I don't know what redlining is." I'm like, yeah, your sister doesn't actually know what it is either, but that was an incredibly educated guess. Now, here's the deal. She's not really right. Redlining is not how the neighborhood got black. It is how it got poor and how it stayed poor. So for those who don't know the term, right, it was a policy very much formal for decades, for generations. It still happens indirectly, but it used to be very formal. Where banks would put maps on the wall, they would take a red marker, they'd mark around the outlines of black communities, and anybody who lived in the contours of that neighborhood was going to be denied a loan. You couldn't get a loan. Didn't matter if you had good credit, didn't matter if you had a good job, didn't matter if you'd gone to college, none of that mattered. You weren't going to get a loan simply because you lived in that neighborhood. Now, that's not how the neighborhood became black, but it is how it was starved of capital. So I decided, you know what, my 12-year-old, I mean, it's a good start, right? It's a good thing. I'm going to give her half credit. We'll retake the test later. We're going to start with 50 points, and we're going to let her retake it to get the other 50. But I needed to explain the racial piece, so I started to break that down real shortly for them. I said, look, first you need to know public housing was not created for black folks and brown folks. In fact, quite the opposite. They were excluded from it for the first several years of its existence. It was all white, very much on purpose. The government did it for white people and spent billions of dollars, spending billions of dollars on public housing for white folks to subsidize white folks' housing during the Great Depression. If something like that had been done for black people, we would have called it welfare, we would have called it a handout, we would have called it affirmative action, we would have called it some form of discrimination. But we did it for white people, and we called it macroeconomic policy. So we create public housing to give these poor white folks a leg up during the Depression, but then almost immediately after that, the government says, well, that's not even enough. That's not enough, let's do some other stuff. So they create the FHA loan program, then the VA loan program, then the GI Bill program. Theoretically, these are open to everyone, or at least to returning veterans in the case of the VA and GI Bill. But in practice, people of color were just routinely excluded and unable to participate. 98% of the FHA loans, which were preferential loans given with low interest credit terms by the government, given by banks, but underwritten and guaranteed by the government, 98% of those loans went to white families. If you were a person of color living in the cities and weren't going to give you one, if you were a person of color wanting to use one to go to the suburbs, you couldn't, because you couldn't live in the suburbs. So the reason the neighborhood became black is because the government literally paid for white people to flee the cities. Literally underwrote white flight, literally subsidized white people leaving the cities and going out to the suburbs where only we could live, and then that's how the people who were left behind were overwhelmingly black and brown. Then on the heels of that, the banks come in, they redline the neighborhoods, they won't give loans, that's how it becomes and stays poor. So I go through this, a little bit greater detail than that, but that's basically the sketch. I drop them off at the dance studio. I said, y'all, does that make sense? They were appropriately horrified, so I felt like I'd done my job. Right? I felt pretty good about myself, breaking down mid-20th century housing and race policy in America to 10 and 12-year-old children. But as I pulled away, I had this horrible feeling come over. Right? I started to think about what happens if I don't know the answer to the question. What happens if I don't know the history? What happens if I don't have the sociological context to understand and to explain what my 10-year-old can see with their own eyes? And how many parents wouldn't know that answer? See, I only know it because it's what I do, right? I only know it because it's what I study. Black and brown folks know it because they lived it, right? So parents of color can teach their children because they literally lived through it. But how many of us who are white would not know the answer to that question? Because why would we? We would have had no reason to know it. We didn't have to study it. That wasn't going to be on the test, was it? Like, we didn't have to prove that we knew anything about anything like that to be considered competent enough to graduate high school or get into college or get into grad school or get into law school or get into med school or be a psychologist or be a doctor or be a nurse or be a teacher, even in communities of color. We didn't have to actually know anything about them, right? White folks today don't have to know anything about black and brown communities to go teach in it. They'll give you 5 weeks of training to Teach for America. Let your ass loose anywhere you want to go, right? Oh, you want to go teach in Newark? You ever been to Newark? Nah, but you went to Harvard? Cool, go. What? Right? You don't have to know anything about the space you're going to go to because you're smart. You went to a good college. Right? What kind of thing is that? We have been able to remain ignorant. We have been able to remain oblivious to this entire history. So what happens if you're not aware of that history? I mean, a lot of really nice, good, well-intended white parents wouldn't know the answer to my kid's question or their kids. If the kid asks a question and you don't know the answer, what do you think the kid does? Do they stop wondering? No, children are really inquisitive, right? They might stop asking because you didn't know the first time. So they're not going to waste their time talking to you again. But they're going to keep wondering. And the only answer they're going to be able to come up with is the one that this society gave them, right? So when you're not taught the actual history, you come up with your own answer. What's the answer, y'all? You know the answer. It's the only thing. It's the only one you can come up with. It's the one thing we've all been taught. I don't care what your racial background is. I don't care what your class background is. I don't care where you grew up in the United States or if you grew up somewhere else and moved here but have been here for more than a week. But one thing that I know we've all been taught, because it is the secular gospel of this country, it is Genesis 1:1 in the Bible of Americanism, is the idea that, well, anybody can make it if they just work hard. So if you didn't make it, it's your own damn fault. And wherever you end up is all about your own effort. This notion of meritocracy, right? Rugged individualism. Now, let's just be clear, as a side note, right? There's no such thing as a rugged individual. People who say that they got everything that they got on their own are simply lying or delusional and in need of medication. Not just therapy, actual medication. Because there's no such thing as an individual. Human beings are social creatures. We've always lived in community. None of y'all were raised on an island by a porpoise. That would be a rugged individual. That would also be an individual you would need to get the hell away from. Like, if you ever actually meet a rugged individual, you need to run, because that thing is going to be feral. It is not going to have language. Nobody will have ever taught it not to eat you. So run, Forrest, run. Right? There are no rugged individuals. We've all had help. All of us have had help. Some of that help has been connected to race and certain advantages stemming from race. Some of it has been about gender. Some of it has been about parental socioeconomic status. Some of it's just luck, y'all. Right? Some of it is just luck. And we all know this because we all know people who've worked hard their whole lives and have nothing to show for it, maybe in our own families. We also know people who were born on third base and think they hit a triple and never had to work hard a day in their lives. People who, I don't know, just as a random side note, maybe inherited or were given $400 million worth of real estate over the course of their lives by their daddy and still want you to think they're a self-made billionaire, maybe like that. Right? So we know there are people who are where they are not owing to simply their own effort, but owing to a whole confluence of factors. And yet we don't want to admit that because, oh God, but if you say that, like the American dream, you're trying to incentivize effort. I get it. I got those two daughters. You think I don't tell them they can be what they want? I tell them you can be whatever you want to be if you work really hard, but then I add a little asterisk at the end. Right? The asterisk is the part that says, yeah, some conditions may apply. So let's check out the codicil at the bottom of the contract, right? And the codicil says, yeah, you can be anything you want to be if you work hard, and if you understand that as young women, there are going to be men, and sadly, even some other women, who will seek to undermine you and look down upon you because you are women. So being all that you're capable of being requires not just working hard as an individual, but working hard collectively to alter systems of inequality. And if you do that, then you can be whatever it is. But see, as a society, we don't want to put the asterisk. We don't believe in the asterisk. We just believe in the empty promise. You can be anything. Here's the problem. If I teach you that, and then you grow up and you can look around even at the age of 10, and you can see these folks living like this over here, and these folks living like that over there, what do you think your 10-year-old or your 15-year-old or your 35-year-old, for that matter, brain does with the teachings that you were given about wherever you end up being all about you, and the objective reality of inequality that you can see with your own eyes? All you can do is say to yourself, well, I guess these people must deserve to be living. Right? They must not work as hard. They must have bad values. They must have made bad choices. And all these people over here, they must have made good choices. They must have been smarter. As soon as you conclude that, you will never seek to fix inequality. Because why would you? Why would you try to do anything about inequality or the opportunity structure if you think that wherever people ended up was all about their own failures or their own genius? You wouldn't change a thing, see? So you can't alter systems of inequality in the job market if you think it just reflects talent. You can't alter inequalities in school outcomes. All this idea about closing the quote-unquote achievement gap, why the hell would you do that? You wouldn't if you actually listen to the propaganda of the culture and don't learn to interrogate it. But where are you going to learn to interrogate it? How many school systems are going to teach you to interrogate it? It's hard to interrogate that, right? Because that's the American creed. That's like going to church on Sunday, sitting in the third row of pews, and when the preacher gets done with the sermon, jumping up and going, yeah, that was really nice, but there is no God. It doesn't go over well, right? It's a hard sell. But here's the thing, if we don't learn to think critically about that promise that we make, if we don't talk about the historical context that has gotten in the way of that, if we don't provide the sociological imagination to young people, they will default to positions that reinforce racism. They will default to positions that reinforce classism. They'll look down on poor white folks too, right? Poor white folks, what's wrong with them? They're clearly not smart enough either. Women who don't have as many positions of power, well, it must be that they're just not as capable. So sexism, racism, classism, all of these things become almost logical if you're not learning to critique the dominant narrative. So we are all products of our learning, and in this case, products of what we did not learn. Okay? So if I look around and I see, for instance, right now, that the median white household in America has 15 times the net worth of the median black household. Right? The American ideology tells me, well, that must be because they just didn't save their money. That just because they squander their money. They just don't have the same investment strategies that we white people have. It's funny that we can still believe that after a group of almost exclusively white bankers destroyed the economy with their genius investment policies and practices last decade. Right? That wasn't black folks that brought the economy to its knees. Wasn't Mexicans, documented or not, that brought the economy to its knees. It was a bunch of the highest SAT-having business school degree white boys on Wall Street, and they lost roughly 20% of the accumulated net worth of this country in about 18 months. Took 235 years to build it up, year and a half to wipe it out. That takes some real talent, y'all. Or a decided lack thereof. But they all got their bonuses and none of them went to jail, right? So it can't just be about investment genius. It's not that we're smarter. It's not that we work harder. It must be a history of inequality that explains these kind of things. And of course, that is what it is. Because on that wealth data that I just gave you, the really important statistic is this. White households headed by high school dropouts have 1/3 more wealth on average than black households headed by college graduates. White households headed by people that didn't even finish high school better off in terms of assets than black folks who are headed by college graduates. Why? I mean, we say education is the great equalizer. I guess not, right? Because these folks stayed in school, got their degrees, still worse off than white folks that didn't even finish 12th grade. Well, it must be because the white folks who didn't finish 12th grade are still more likely to have gotten a little something from their family, maybe a little piece of land, maybe a house, something like that. And those black folks are not as likely to have received that. Same thing with Latinx folks, far less likely to have net worth, far less likely to receive inheritance, right? And be able to pass down assets. So there are reasons for our inequality, but if we don't learn how to interrogate the dominant narrative of the country, we'll never get at what those are. We'll look at incarceration rates for things like drugs, and we'll decide, well, black folks just must do drugs more. Latinx folks just must do drugs more. There's not a shred of data to suggest that, and every bit of data says the opposite. That white folks use drugs, possess drugs, and deal drugs at rates that are identical or roughly so, depending on the year, as black and brown folks. But who's going to jail? Depending on the state, we're 5 to 9 times more likely to be incarcerated for a simple drug possession offense. And possession offenses are 85% of all drug arrests. They're not for manufacture. They're not for massive drug kingpin dealing. It's simple possession 85% of the time. 5 times more likely to 9 times more likely to get locked up. And let me just, as a side note, I would say, like, I didn't need that data to know that the war on drugs was not about drugs. I could have told you that from personal experience, and I can tell you now, because the statute of limitations has expired on this thing. So, really can't do anything to me now. Quick story, just to make the point. 32 years ago this April, I was a student at Tulane in 1988, coming back from a debate tournament in San Antonio. I was in a rental car. It was me, my debate partner, another 2-person team, and the coach. We get stopped, going 15 miles an hour over the speed limit. I'm behind the wheel in Gonzales, Texas. I get pulled over. I'm a little nervous. For 2 reasons. Number one, I don't like being pulled over by, nobody likes being pulled over by police. Even white people don't like it. It's usually not as dangerous, but we don't like it. It's not something we do. We don't sign up for it. Is what I'm saying. So I'm a little nervous, but I'm especially nervous because I know what's in the briefcase of my debate coach. And I don't mean like debate evidence or pens. Right? I mean what else is in the briefcase of the coach, which at that particular moment happens to be 2.5 ounces of weed, 8 balls of cocaine, 12 hits of ecstasy, and 6 sheets of acid. For those of you who are not particularly well versed in the narcotic arts, trust me when I tell you, that is a lot of product. That is way more product than you can do yourself, and if you get stopped by a cop and they find that level of product, you will not be arrested for simple possession. You will probably go down with possession with intent to distribute. So I'm a little nervous. The officer comes to the window, I roll it down. This, for the young people, is a thing we used to have to do. You know, it means absolutely nothing to you now. Roll down the window. The officer asks for my license and registration. I said, registration's in the glove box, it's a rental car. The guy next to me hands it to me. I'm looking for my license. I pull out my wallet. I cannot find it. Cannot find it. Getting real nervous now. I'm sweating and my voice is cracking like I'm 13 years old in puberty again. I cannot find the license. It seemed like it took 2 weeks. It was probably 30 seconds. Right? But I can't find it. He says, you want to come sit in the cruiser? The light's better. I really did not want to go sit in the police car, but I didn't know that I had a choice. So I said, sure, just like that. Voice went up, 8 or 9 octaves. I don't even know if there are 8 or 9 octaves, but it went up very high. And then I go sit in this car. He's right, by the way, side note. Like, much better in a cruiser. And I'm sitting there looking for my license. I'm flipping through, and can't find it, still can't find it. But I do come across my fake ID, which is completely not helpful in moments. It is helpful every other day of the week. Today, it is not helpful at all. He says, isn't that it? Which is a logical thing for him to say, because right at the top, of the license it says Maine driver's license, as in the state of Maine. I am not from Maine, had never actually been to Maine, but the kid who made the ID was like, what state do you want to be from? I'm like, let's pick one that nobody knows what the license looks like. He said, how about Maine? I said, sure. So he makes it. The cop sees it. He says, isn't that it? I'm like, no. I have no idea what that is. That is like a craft project. He reaches for the wallet because he's not believing me. I think he thinks that maybe I'm lying to him, right? With good reason. He starts to reach for the wallet. Just as he reaches for it, I turn one more flap and I find the license. I don't know where it had been hiding. It's stuck together. I don't know what happened, but I find it. I pull it out. Here it is. Takes it from me. Holds it up. Looks at me very intently for about 5-6 seconds. Says, is this the one you want to go with? I said, yeah, that one right there, Tennessee, that's me, Nashville, Tennessee, right there. I said, okay, wrote me a $75 ticket for speeding and let me go on my way. Let me suggest to you that if you believe that interaction in a rental car, having a hard time finding a license, sweating, being nervous, having a fake ID, which at that time was a misdemeanor offense in the state of Texas, punishable by $5,000 and up to 30 days in jail. If you think that story is going to end with a $75 ticket and me going my merry way back to New Orleans in 1988 or tomorrow, I think you haven't been paying attention. And I don't mean to this speech, I mean to life in general in this country. Because if I'm a person of color and all those other factors are exactly the same, they're going to search that car. I'm almost sure of it, and they're going to find the drugs in my coach's briefcase, and I don't know who's going to be giving this talk to you right now, but it's not going to be me, because I would have been in prison, and I don't think they'll let you Skype it in. Right? So what does that mean? It means that we're all implicated, first of all, in the system, that there's a bigger problem that we need to be aware of, that who's going to prison, who's being locked up is not necessarily a reflection of who's committing certain types of crime, particularly drug-related offenses, for which there's been such a spike in incarceration in the last 30 years. But again, unless you've experienced something like that, or unless you've been given the sociological imagination to see through the simplistic answer, you might simply turn on the television, see black and brown folks disproportionately being perp walked on the evening news, or on Cops, or what are all those shows, Real Stories, The Highway Patrol, or whatever they are, right, that have disproportionately shown lower income folks and people of color relative to their actual offenses in those categories for which they're being arrested, and get the impression that, well, those folks are locked up because they're just bad people. And these people over here are not locked up because they're not. Right? That's the way that we think if we're not given a different context. And you think about robbery, you think about people stealing money. You know, every year in this country, employers steal 3 times more money from their employees in a thing called wage theft, right, than all the street robberies combined, all the bank robberies combined. 3 times more money lost because employers rip off their employees by not paying them their tips, not paying them prep time for like setting up in restaurants, not paying them the overtime that they deserve, paying them less than the rate that they should have been paid, ripping off immigrants who they think won't know any better and won't say anything to them, right? 3 times more being, but you think any of those folks go to jail? Do we pathologize any of it? If I steal $500 out of the till of the register of your restaurant, you're going to have me arrested, and I'm going to go to jail. But if you steal thousands of dollars from me over the course of a year, all I can do is hope to find a lawyer and sue you to get it back, right? Because we don't treat certain folks as criminal, we treat other folks as criminal. Again, that requires, though, somebody to talk to you about that, and you're not probably going to get that in your 8th grade American history class, right? You're not going to get that in 12th grade classes. You're not necessarily even going to get that in college. So we have to do a much better job about thinking through the ways that we teach and what we teach. Our educational system has really been predicated on maintaining these inequalities, not challenging them. Right? We know that because everybody that set this system up tells us that. This isn't me just like weaving some conspiracy theory. It's not a conspiracy at all. It's what sociologists call functionalism. Right? Systems remain in place because they work for the people with power. When they stop working for the people with power, they get changed. Right? So if you're waiting at the end of a sausage factory and you're waiting at the end of the conveyor belt for chicken nuggets to come out, clearly you didn't read the sign, right? It's a sausage factory. It's going to give you sausage. So what is the American educational system set up to do? It's set up to produce inequality, not equality. Everybody says education is the great equalizer. Everybody just gets an education, everything will be equal. No. People have been getting increasing levels of education, like I said, and still have less wealth than the people without it. Black and brown folks with college degrees still anywhere from 50% to 85% more likely to be unemployed than white folks with degrees, even when they majored in the same thing. So we're not getting equality with education. We're not even getting closer to equality. We're actually moving further apart in many ways, even as people become more educated. Why? Because that was the way it was intended to be. Go back and read what Thomas Jefferson said in Notes on the State of Virginia. He said, you know, what we need is about 6 years of compulsory schooling. He was just talking about white folks. He didn't mean for black people or native folk, obviously. He was just talking about white people, right? 6 years of compulsory mandatory education. Why did he say that? He said that so that we can, quote, rake a few geniuses from the rubbish. So he was basically Thomas Jefferson, who, you know, has historically been white people's, like, one of white people's favorite white people. But Thomas Jefferson was basically saying to white folks, no, I don't love y'all, like, most of you are garbage. Like, and you know I don't like the black folks because I'm only black. And you know I don't like the indigenous folk because we're hunting them. But I don't really like most of y'all either, so we're going to give you 6 years of mandatory education so we can figure out which handful of y'all are geniuses and which of the rest of y'all are rubbish going to work for us, right? So the purpose of schooling was to produce inequality, and Jefferson, keep in mind, was a leading educational thinker of his day. Founded the University of Virginia. He was a major educational philosopher. People turned to him for theories on schooling, and there's his theory. Fast forward, Woodrow Wilson becomes president of the U.S. Before that, he's president of Princeton. He had a similar attitude. He was also a well-respected educational theorist that people would turn to for ideas about how to run schools. What did Wilson say? He said, what we need is we need a small group to prepare themselves for the receipt of a liberal education. Liberal at that time, that was the term for college education. It didn't mean liberal versus conservative. It was just higher ed, right? And he said, but what we need is a much larger group to forego the privilege of a liberal education and prepare themselves for the performance of certain difficult manual tasks. So he's basically saying what Jefferson said. We need a handful of people to run stuff, the rest of y'all will do the heavy lifting. Because we're too precious to lift things. We're too precious to sweat. We're too precious to do the hard work. We're the smart people. We're going to run stuff, the rest of you. And Wilson also only talking about white people. Wilson, hey, it was a vicious racist. He definitely wasn't thinking about black and brown folks. He's just saying most of y'all white folks are no count also. And I don't really care if you have an education either. In fact, it'd be better for all of us if you didn't. So again, inequality is not an accident. It's sort of being done on purpose. Now you may say, well, Tim, yeah, but that was the 1780s or whatever. And then it was like the early 1900s. Surely it's changed, right? Well, let's think about it. So 2001, George W. Bush has been elected. No Child Left Behind has been passed, right, as the law of the land, educational reform policy. And I turned on the Sunday talk shows one Sunday, and I'm watching an interview with William Bennett. William Bennett, some of you will recall, was, until recently, the worst educational secretary that the country had ever had. But records are, they're meant to be broken, so there you have it. Nobody was ever supposed to break Lou Gehrig's record of consecutive games, but by God it happened, and it's happened here as well. But he's holding tight at number 2, I think is a fair assessment. Bill Bennett is on the talk shows, and he's being asked about No Child Left Behind, because he was education secretary. So they're talking about NCLB, and they asked Bill Bennett, big question, Mr. Secretary, what do you think the biggest problem with American education is today? And that's a huge question. It's such a big question that if you ask me that on national television, even though I think I'm pretty smart and I got some answers, I might be like, can we take a break? I'd like to think about that during the commercial. Like, I need a glass of water or something. Let me get my mind straight because I don't want to get it wrong. I don't want to offer a stupid answer. Bill Bennett didn't need a break. Bill Bennett didn't need a glass of water. Bill Bennett didn't need a cup of coffee. Bill Bennett was ready with the answer to the question, reminding you again, what's the biggest problem with American education? Bill Bennett says, biggest problem is too many people are going to college. Now, in that moment, I was in sort of an ecumenical mood. I thought, I'm going to give him a little slack. Maybe he has more to say in that sentence. You know how sometimes you'll be talking and words will get caught, like right here in your throat, and you had more to say, but like, it was like your throat did an internal ellipses, the ... and there's more coming, but you're like, it's like when you're texting, and the ... you're just waiting, there's more, you're waiting for the more. I was waiting for the more, right? Thinking maybe he was gonna say, well, there are too many people going to college that can't afford it, because it's too expensive. That's an acceptable answer. It's one of the biggest problems in American education. Or maybe he was going to say, well, there are too many people going to college who aren't really prepared because we haven't fully funded and resourced our K-12 schools. That's an acceptable answer also. Seems reasonable. Yeah, there's no ellipses at all in Bill Bennett's statement. There's not even a comma. There's no M dash. It's just a period at the end of the sentence. Bill Bennett just wants you to know too many people are going. Now, who's he talking about? He doesn't say. But he doesn't have to say it, does he? He's not talking about the rich and mediocre children of rich and mediocre parents, of whom there are millions in this country. You do realize, like, all those prep schools on the East Coast, boarding schools, there are kids there that actually do get C's and D's, right? Pretty mediocre rich people. They're not real bright, but nobody ever goes to the guidance counselor at those schools and says, you know, I know you're thinking about law school, but can I interest you in a job as a tool and die operator or maybe working in the fast food industry because that might be better for you? Nobody ever does that. That kid with the C at the prep school, right, whose daddy is rich, we know they're going to business school. We know they're going to law school. We know they're going to medical school. They're certainly going to undergraduate because they are not the rubbish, right? They are the geniuses. They are the ones who should prepare themselves for the receipt of a liberal education in Wilson's terms. We never question their presence in our institutions. What he's talking about is working class people, right? And he's talking about people of color. Working class folks of all colors and people of color who are accessing higher ed in ways that they wouldn't have in previous generations. What he's really articulating on national television is the philosophy of the slaveholder, right? Because the slaveholder's mentality was, if they all learn to read, who's going to pick the cotton? And now it's if they all go to college, who's going to pick up the garbage, and who's going to change the bedpans in the hospitals, and who's going to pick the strawberries, and who's going to change the sheets in the hotels, right? Because if they all go to college, they're going to think they're too good for that. How do I know that? I know that because I went to college and they told me I wasn't. They told me that I'm too good to apparently pick up my own garbage, y'all. Like garbage, think about garbage collection. The sanitation engineers in my neighborhood, that's like the most important job in my neighborhood and yours, right? Like so important that if they don't show up, like if those two guys that do that every week for us don't show up for like 6 weeks, they're just like, I'm not coming. Like I'm just not coming. Like we're gonna have bubonic plague on my block, y'all. People are gonna be dying, right? Like my wife's gonna be like, Tim, what are we gonna do with the garbage? I don't know. I don't know where to take it. I got no idea where the landfill's at. I don't know where the recycle place is. I guess we're just gonna die. That's gonna be my answer, because I don't have a clue. On the other hand, if the dude that sells stock down the block, or the guy that's 3 doors down that sells pharmaceuticals, if they decide to take 6 weeks off, nobody's going to miss them, man. Life is going to go on. Somebody else is going to sell that stock. Somebody else is going to sell those pharmaceuticals. No one is going to die because they took a vacation. But yet we pay the pharmaceutical sales rep 6 to 7 figures. We pay the stockbroker 6 to 7 figures. We pay the sanitation engineers about 19.7 and really lousy benefits, at least where I'm from. Some places better because they got better union contracts. But you know what I mean. We're not paying based on actual merit. We're not paying based on contribution. So if you have a labor market that requires inequality, you have to have a school system that produces inequality, right? Form follows function. You can't have a labor market that produces inequality and then a school system that produces equality. That just won't work. Where are you going to put everybody? You've got to slot them in places. So that's why we give standardized tests to unstandardized students from unstandardized schools, with unstandardized families, unstandardized curriculum, unstandardized teachers in their K-12 schools, right? Because it maintains the illusion of fairness, but really produces inequality. The number one most highly correlated factor with standardized test scores is zip code. You tell me your zip code, I can tell you what the median test score in your neighborhood is. And worse than that, here's the really dirty little secret. I have friends who have worked for the testing companies. I don't know if you know this, but if you come from a low-performing school or a low-performing zip code, and you happen to be a really high-achieving kid who does well, let's say on the ACT, you know, and maybe most of the kids in your school don't, maybe most of the kids in your zip code don't, but you do, because you worked your ass off and studied really hard and you applied yourself, and you score considerably better than the norm, they will open up a case on you thinking that you have cheated. Every single time. And it will be your burden to prove that you did not cheat. And if you cannot prove it, they will cancel the scores. So this is the kind of system that we have, and yet we're still acting as if we have a real commitment to equity. What would it look like if we did? Here's what it would look like. It'd be an educational system that was predicated on the idea that we can't tinker around the edges of education policy. We can't just spend a little more money here and a little more money there. We have to fundamentally revolutionize and upend the purpose of education and what it is we're educating for. Right now, we are educating people to just be compliant, right? To just go along with whatever it is somebody tells them to do, to not question authority, certainly never question authority. And then we get upset when they become defiant in the face of authority. But the reality is they don't want to learn in that system. Young people can tell when they're being lied to. Young people can tell when they're being manipulated, and especially if they're poor and working class, especially if they're people of color who know that there's something wrong in this society that affects them disproportionately. So what we need is an educational system that speaks to that reality. You want to close those so-called achievement gaps, you have to speak to the reality that young people of color are experiencing in this country. We don't do that. And how could we do that? We could do it like they did it in Tucson for about a decade until the state of Arizona decided to shut them down. What did they do in Tucson? They created, in the Tucson Unified School District, the Mexican American Studies Program, La Raza Studies Program, Chicanic Studies. It wasn't mandatory, and it wasn't just for Chicanics kids. Anybody could enroll in it, but it was a track in their high school that would allow students to go and take literature, history, science, math, all their courses with a Mexican-American framework and Mexican-American historical and cultural lens, right? And they did this voluntarily. They had about 15 kids go through the program, right? And of the 1,500 kids that went through that program, 70% of them went on to college. But the kids that were just like them, from the same neighborhoods, the same school district, same demographic background, even the kids who were bright and had been getting A's and B's but didn't go through that program, did the traditional curriculum, only 17% of them went on to college. Right? The only real difference was that one set of curricula was setting these kids on fire for learning, and the other one was boring them to death and making them withdraw from school. But Arizona, in their infinite wisdom, the legislature comes in, they kill the program because they said it's un-American. Why is it un-American? Well, because you're teaching these kids that we stole their land. Well, we did steal their land. It's not really an arguable, it's not an arguable position if you know the history of how the Southwest became ours. Like, it wasn't just like, here, have this. You know, there was a war, we started it on the basis of false pretense, right? And took their land. And these are people literally whose families have just been trying to come home, and we changed the locks. And it's like, you can't do that. But they know the history. It's not telling these Chicanics kids things they didn't know. It's just they didn't want the schools teaching it. So they shut the program down and denied that, even though, not in spite of, I would say because it was working. Precisely because it was reducing those disparities, it wasn't allowed to continue. This is the kind of thing that we do in our society that we need to undo. There was a good example of a teacher tried to undo this undo this process or rethink this process out in Denver, in Cherry Creek School District, which is a suburban area of Denver. A couple of years ago, he noticed that his black kids in his math class, I think it was like 9th grade or something, they weren't doing real well. But he knew they were bright. He interacted with them, he knew they were capable. He didn't buy into the idea that they weren't capable of learning and succeeding. So he decided to go and try something different, right? They were getting D's and F's. But he goes in one day and he goes up to the whiteboard and he starts putting up all this data, all these charts and graphs and, figures and statistics, but he doesn't label any of it, so nobody knows what it is. The kids are getting nervous, right? They're all like, this is going to be on the test. And finally, after 15 minutes of filling the board with data and statistics, he turns around and he starts telling them what it is. He says, this right here is the relative incarceration rates of black folks, brown folks, and white folks in the greater Denver area. This is the housing values of black folks, brown folks, and white folks in the greater Denver area. This is the infant mortality data. This is the unemployment rate data. This is the poverty data. This is the, whatever, life expectancy data. In other words, he was showing the algebra of inequality, right, on the board. He said, now, this is evidence that somebody's trying to kill you, because they don't care if you become one of these numbers or not. They'll be happy to let you be one of them. I'm interested in knowing whether you want to become one or blow these up, because if you want to blow them up, let's go. We can think of ways to do it, but there are people trying to kill you, and I'm down to change that with you if you're interested, right? And all of a sudden, these young black men, these are young black men in particular, right? And this is highly relevant in a place like Indianapolis, whereas at least as of a few years ago, I know that the 4-year graduation rate for black males in the Indianapolis public schools was the lowest in the United States, right? And it's certainly still among the lowest. I have no doubt that that hasn't changed substantially. So you had these young black men who weren't achieving, but this teacher said, I'm going to make math, I'm going to make numbers relevant to their day-to-day life. I'm not just going to tell them, do math because the state of Colorado tells you to do math. I'm not going to say do math because math is fun. I'm not going to say do math because math will help you make more money when you get older and get a good job. I'm going to ask you to learn numbers and math, statistics, because this could be the thing that keeps you alive. And all of a sudden, these young men got a fire lit under them. They realized something. It wasn't that this guy had told them something they didn't know. They knew. They knew what was going on. They just never had a person in authority confirm it before. To actually have someone look at them and say, that thing that you think is happening, it is happening, and here's the evidence to prove it, right? Which is like CSI stuff, right? It's like, look, it's like forensic science, right? Like, look, here's the evidence of that thing that you already thought was real. Now these kids realize, man, I got to learn this better than they know or they'll kill me with it, right? So now they start getting A's and B's. They create a mentoring group for 8th grade kids of color called the Brotherhood, scared the hell out of some people, right? And all these folks like, whoa, the Brotherhood. Is that a gang? It's a math gang. Very easy. These kids start getting A's and B's, but the school board and the principal called in this teacher and said, you can't tell these kids somebody's trying to kill them. It's like, why not? It's like, you just can't. We got other ways of reaching. He's like, well, I've been doing this for more than a minute. I haven't found that other way. But this worked, and they went from getting D's and F's to getting A's and B's, so I think I'm going to stick with this, thanks. You know? But they were trying to shut it down, not because it wasn't working, but because it was working, right? That's what we see over and over and over again in our school systems, that when we actually start to speak of these issues as if they were highly relevant to people's lives, it makes a difference. We have to keep on that track, even as they try to shut us down. The last thing I'll say about this, I think it's something to think about. You all can contemplate this as an institution, and you can contemplate it in whatever role as educators that you possess or may possess in the future. You're thinking of being teachers, or you're thinking of being involved in the process of education, or even nonprofit organizations that work with schools. We talk a lot about STEM, right? Science, technology, engineering, and math. And that's all good. And obviously it's important. We need scientists, we need tech, we need engineers to make the bridges not fall down. I'm all for that. And we need mathematicians. I wasn't going to be one, but I'm glad some of y'all are in for that. Right? That's good, we need that. But the thing I worry about a little bit is the STEM push. And we're also real big on the push to try to get women in STEM who've been marginalized and kept out of it, and people of color. Again, all of that's really good. But I do worry that as we focus on science and tech and engineering and math, I worry about a couple of things. Number one, I worry that we may get down the line 15, 20 years and have a whole lot of really bright people that can code really well, right? That can build that next app for your phone, that can repair your computer, that can tinker with AI, or whatever it is we're going to be doing with each other technologically in 15 or 20 years, who knows, right? Might have a lot of people that can program stuff, but I'm not sure we're going to have a lot of people that have the civic sensibility, right, to maintain multiracial pluralistic democracy. Because there is no app for that, right? There is no app for figuring out how we maintain, or at least create, because we really don't have it yet, a truly multicultural, pluralistic democracy. And our civics education is withering on the vine while we focus on STEM. Now, I want to suggest we need more than just what we think of as civics education, and I've got this term for it, and I don't know if it'll catch on or not, but I keep saying it so nobody steals it. Y'all mention it, just know where it came from. I don't take credit for much. This one I'm going to take credit for. I call it mesh education. Okay? The M is for media literacy, because we desperately need that. We live in a culture where people, particularly young people, being bombarded with media. And I'm not even just talking about political media that they need to be able to sift through. I mean even commercial media, right? When they're being sold products, being manipulated by advertisers, which is what advertisers do. They're trying to get your money, whether it's on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, or on television, right? Or in a movie theater, whatever. So media literacy is the M. We need more of that. E is for ethics. We don't engage young people very much in ethical dilemmas and conversations, philosophical conversations about how to resolve some of the biggest dilemmas facing us, not only around issues like race, but around the ecology, the environment, the future of the planet, right? There are ethical dilemmas. How do we balance the needs of the economy with the needs of the ecology? That's an ethical discussion. But how often do we engage that? Well, maybe if you're a philosophy major, you'll engage it, but we can't just leave that to philosophy majors. We all have to be part of that. The S is for sociology. Because sociology is that discipline which teaches you the dynamics of groups and power, who has what and why they do, and who doesn't and why they don't. And that helps you understand things like the question that my daughter asked about the neighborhood that we were driving through. If you don't understand sociology and you don't get that sociological imagination, you won't know how to interpret the phenomena that you see. And then history, the H. Our history education is pathetic. We still have children growing up in this country who believe, as so many of us were led to believe, in multiple generations, that we're more likely to know the story, y'all, of George Washington and that cherry tree. Right? Y'all know the story. George Washington chopped down a cherry tree when he was a child. He was just so doggone honest that he couldn't lie to his daddy. So he said, "Daddy, I did it. I did it. I chopped down the tree." because I can't die. Well, that story is a lie. That did not happen. That did not happen, y'all. The person that actually first wrote that story had already done a biography of Washington like 7 years earlier and didn't include that little tidbit, and then proceeded to not say where he found that little tidbit. That didn't happen. Why did we tell that story? Why did we told that story because it was a way to cast the first president as this almost deity, right? Just a way to think of him in this glorified way. Well, he's just so honest, right? I remember the first book I ever read. I'm not proud of it because of the content, but I read really early, like before I was 3, I finished this book, and Mom was real impressed, and I was too, until I reflected many years later what the book was. It was called Meet Andrew Jackson, the children's book about Andrew Jackson, right? And what did it say in there? This is a history book for kids, y'all, and it said, for instance, when young Andy left to go to the frontier, his mother sat him down and said, "Son, don't ever take that which isn't yours." And it was a lesson that young Andy would remember and follow the rest of his life. No, he literally violated it like the week after he walked out the door. Don't take what's not yours, like the frontier. Don't take what's not yours, the labor power of black people who you will hold in bondage. But this is what and then it says when he died, there's a great part at the end, it says, when Andrew Jackson died, his slaves sang a sad old song. So I'm supposed to envision black people around Andrew Jackson's deathbed singing Go Down Moses, right? This didn't happen. No actual historian thinks that any of this happened, but we have kids that still learn that stuff, right? More than actually learn the stuff that was in the 1619 Project over the summer in the New York Times, which then they did hear about and rebelled against. The idea that slavery was actually central, foundational to the creation of the United States of America, which isn't even a remotely controversial position among historians, right? But this idea that, well, you can't teach that, right? We got a cherry tree to talk about, y'all. We got young Andy Jackson to talk about. We have these prettier things to talk about. So we've got to have mesh education. But you know why else we've got to have mesh education? And then I promise I'm done, I'll take questions. The other reason is this. If you want to do STEM, and again, I'm not saying STEM's not important. If you want to do STEM right, you've got to add mesh to it, right? Because science has been weaponized historically against marginalized populations, right? Science is what drove the Holocaust. And by the way, what was done in Europe during World War II was not from the mind of Adolf Hitler. That was from the mind of America's best scientists. Stanford, right? Yale, Harvard, Princeton, all of America's best institutions. It was our scientists that created the eugenic sterilization programs that were at the heart of the Holocaust, that created the notion of race science and the superiority of certain people and the inferiority of others. It was science that was used to justify the sterilization, involuntary sterilization of over 70,000 women of color and several thousand white women as well in the 20th century, who were deemed unfit to bear children by the courts because they just were deemed too unintelligent to bear children. So they were forcibly sterilized against their will in the name of science, right? So if you want to do science, they're excellent. But you've got to understand that science is not this objective thing. A lot of times scientists think it is. Right? They say, well, we're scientists, we're objective, we're just following the facts, as opposed to you social scientists who are fudging things and doing fake research. Right? But the truth is, science is not that objective. What we study is a choice we make, right? And what we don't study is a choice we make. And in every generation, we've used science badly to justify oppression. So if we want to do good STEM, and by the way, if you want to inspire marginalized people to take up STEM, what do you think is going to be a better way to inspire young black and brown kids, or women of all colors, or working class white folks, for that matter, and poor white folks, to take up STEM disciplines? Do you think the most motivating thing is going to be, well, you can get a good job and make a lot of money? Look, if I'm struggling, I can't even envision that. That's not even in my frame of reference. You're just telling me that, but I don't really buy it. What if you told me, though, that if I don't learn this stuff, my people, my community is in jeopardy? That will inspire me, because now I know that the purpose of this thing is collective. It's not just about me, it's about all of us or none of us, right? We have to learn this stuff as a way to survive and to thrive and to move forward. So education has to be about that. It has to be about collective uplift. And too often we sell it as individual uplift, right? We tell young people, stay in school so you can get out of here, get out of this neighborhood and go get a good job and make something of yourself. But when we say that to a child, what we've just told them is everything you come from is broken and busted and wrong. And everybody who you thought loved you is trifling and no count, and your job should be to get away from them as quickly as you can. Right? As opposed to coming back, staying here, uplifting the entire community, and turning the educational system on its head so that it works for the benefit of the masses and not just a handful of people. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate you. I want to take some questions if you have them. I mean, we've got microphones, but it's silly to do that. I don't think you have to come up. If you're loud enough, you can just probably hear it. Or if you want to take a mic to somebody else. It's weird if they have to come all this way and then I have to look at them 5 feet. It's going to be odd. So if you have a question, we will take this.
You spoke about epigenetic memory.
Yeah.
So the passing down of trauma. You also stated that we are a product of learning.
Yeah.
A product of what we do not learn. So the first question I have is, do you believe in the possibility of epigenetic love? Can we as individuals act in a way that supersedes systems and set imprints on our genetic code?
Interesting question. Well, certainly I see no reason why that's not possible. If one is possible, the other should be. If we are products of our trauma, then we are also products of the love and compassion that we're also capable of as humans, right? Because we know that humans, think about human nature, everybody has an opinion about it, and they're all correct and they're all wrong, right? Most people will say, well, you know, violence is just human nature. Well, it's part of human nature. It's part of all animal nature, right? Complex organisms' nature is violent, but it's also compassion and love and altruism. Those are also parts of human nature. The question is always which one's going to win today, right? And so I think in a sense, if we practice compassion and we practice love, and we do that in a way that, for instance, lowers the stress levels in our children, right? So that we don't have the allostatic overloading that we're seeing with kids today. So the opposite of post-traumatic stress disorder, right, is homeostasis. It is the sort of steady state of our emotions in line with our bodies. And obviously, if we do that, there's no reason to think that that can't be passed down. Obviously, if I have lower blood pressure and I'm healthier and I have less stress hormones, a couple things are going to happen. If I'm a woman and I become pregnant, there's going to be less chance that there's going to be damage to the placenta, that there's going to be some kind of a detachment that is directly related to stress and stress hormone levels and blood pressure. There's going to be less likelihood of low infant birth weight if I'm less stressed, and so that too will then have an epigenetic effect. So I think the odds are yes. I think that the thing is, of course, that for whatever reason it seems, because we've all been victims of trauma, but we've also been loved. I mean, all of us in this room have experienced love and compassion, and we've experienced drama and trauma. And I think for most of us, love wins out most of the time, but there are certainly times when it doesn't. And I think the danger is in forgetting that even for those of us who do pass down some real compassion and tendencies for compassion, and maybe there's something biological in that we're passing down both, I guess, at the same time is what I'm saying. Just like human nature can't be bifurcated, neither can the epigenetic effect. Both are possible. What I worry about is that when you are the dominant group in a culture, and the system provides certain benefits to you at the expense of others, what I fear gets passed down is empathic collapse, right? In other words, if I know that the system is unfair, normally and I'm a good person, which I think most people are, I would have empathy, and I would have compassion, and I would have concern. But if my benefits rely on the maintenance of that system, if I actually get paid from that system, directly or indirectly, I can't afford empathy, and so I learn not to empathize. I learn to turn away when children are sitting in cages. Right? I learn to act as if what is happening isn't happening. I learn to think about children who don't look like me or live in another country as being not like me. I come to think of immigrants. My people came legally. Your people came legally because there was no other way to come. There was no law preventing your great whatever from coming. So when your great whatever came legally and there was no law to break in the first place, your great whatever doesn't get patted on the back for their law abidingness. But we sure want to, because we want to look at them as inferior. So we say, well, Mexico's not sending their best. I got newsflash for you. England didn't send their best. Scotland didn't send their best. Germany didn't send their best. Finland, Russia, wherever y'all are from, wherever those of us who are white are from, they're not the best. The best stayed, y'all. The best never get on the boat. The winners don't leave. The winners stay. You know why? Because they're winning. That's why. They stay because winning feels good. Only the losers leave. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong. In fact, there's something beautiful about my family, whether it was in England or Scotland or Russia, saying, to hell with this. We're tired of being oppressed. We're tired of being poor. We're tired of being kicked around. We're going to start over. But if that's beautiful when my family does it, then it's beautiful when a Honduran family does it, and it's beautiful when a Sri Lankan family does it, and it's beautiful when a Salvadoran family does it. But we can't allow that into our brains so often because that requires empathy, and what we've got is this need to, it's like I remember during, when I lived in New Orleans, and you know, I graduated in 1990, and David Duke, former Klansman, modern Nazi, running for Senate, running for governor, and I remember going out to a Mardi Gras parade during that time. This is New Orleans, and it's Mardi Gras time, and that's what you do. And I was at a parade, and there were these working class, low-income white folks, and they're standing on the Mardi Gras parade route with their David Duke stickers, and they've got a sign, because one of the things that was happening at that time, this was after the Duke stuff, actually, it was a year later. There was a city councilwoman, African-American city councilwoman, who had proposed and pushed through a bill in the city council to basically tell all the Mardi Gras crews, that's the name of the parading organization, that they had to integrate, or at least they couldn't stay segregated. They couldn't, you know, by choice, segregate and still parade. Like, you know, New Orleans basically said, it's our city, you're using our streets, you're using our fire and police protection, and you're not going to do any of that if you remain segregated. Well, the old line rich folk, white, super rich New Orleanians got angry and had a sad. And they, you know, and so they were just like, well, we're just not going to parade at all. We're just going to stay home, and we'll just we're not doing it. So they pitched a fit, and they decided not to parade for a couple years. Well, I'm out on this Mardi Gras parade route, and I'm looking at these poor white folks, working class white folks. I just knew, like, you could tell that they're, you know, they were not rich. They were not going to be in any Mardi Gras crew. Okay. And they're sitting there with signs that picture Dorothy Mae Taylor, the black counsel, as a gorilla, right, with exaggerated features, big lips, exaggerated features, about 5 shades darker than she really was on the sign. And I'm thinking to myself, do you think that those rich folk love you? Like, do you actually believe that they're going to invite you to the crew of Comas? You think they're going to let you come to the Rex Ball? Man, they would run you over. They don't care about you. They don't love you. But this guy had to squash his empathy, because if he acknowledges, you know, that he's no better than them, it's almost like, well, you know, I got to be better than somebody. Right? It's what W.E.B. Du Bois called the psychological wage of whiteness. Well, I might not have much, but at least I got more than you. It's like I was talking to this kid online years ago. I used to have a lot more time before I was dad, so I would just like engage with people on email for just days at a time, like, because I had nothing better to do when I wasn't traveling. So I'm sitting there emailing with this kid about the Confederate flag. He's from the South, I'm from the South. I had just written a piece explaining in very clear historical terms why that flag is about slavery, why the Confederacy was only and always about white supremacy. It isn't hard to document. The leaders at the time admitted it, because they didn't have any shame. We lie about it now. So I'm explaining all this, and then I'm making the argument saying, look, man, don't you realize the Confederacy and racism and all this stuff that we in the South have fought to cling to, this has actually hurt white people. This actually hurt you, because even though it put you above somebody, it's why we don't have strong unions. It's why we don't have better collective bargaining, because all the unions were like, we don't want unions in the South, because by God, they'll pay the black folks just like they pay the white folks, and we want more. So we can't have a union if you don't have solidarity wages. So ultimately, we have hurt ourselves as working people in the South, white folks, by clinging to racism, white supremacy, that stupid ass flag. And this kid finally, after about 3 days of this, he writes to me, and we've gone round and round, and he says, you know, you're probably right. And I thought, oh my God, I've done it. I cracked the code. I flipped this kid. I was so excited. I did not recognize the next word, which was but, right? Because when you say that, everything's out the window. You're probably right, but, ... Honestly, he said, I would be willing to work for $1 an hour if we could just go back to segregation. And that was when I was like, there you have it. can't save them all, right? And that's an empathy collapse. And here's the dangerous part of that. That kid, it's not just that he doesn't have empathy for black folks, his empathic collapse has now spread to himself. He's willing to impoverish him. $1 an hour, y'all, $40 a week. Yeah, I'll take that. Just so I can feel better than that guy over there, right? It's like what good is the club if we're all members of it, right? It's like how do I know I'm good if I don't know you're bad, right? And so that's what I fear has happened is I think anything can be epigenetically transmitted. I just fear that most of what is being epigenetically transmitted is really hurting us. And the more we're aware of that, the more we might be able to get hold of it in some therapeutic context. But I just think we don't realize it yet. Next question. Oh,
second part.
just real quick. Yeah, real quick.
Yeah, so you speak about topics that irk some people and prompt reaction. An area that's possibly one of the most intellectually diverse and divisive. How would you suggest as an individual go about starting the discourse or discussion with another without being in a position of opposition?
I think the way is to start with yourself. You know, the reason that I tell the stories that I tell is because I could spend a lot of time giving a bunch of data, statistics, facts. I gave some, right? I gave some. But I don't want to do that because, number one, it's not what changes people, it's not what affects people. The research is real clear on this, that what changes people is narrative, what changes people is stories, what affects them is the stories you tell. So if I want to convince you the war on drugs is about race privilege for those of us who are white and was targeting people of color, I can tell you a story. I got more than the one I told you that would make the point. I could also drag out data, but in my experience, the story is what will get you at least to listen. So I would start with the self. If I want to challenge someone else around their biases, I need to admit my own biases. I can't point at you and say, you've got this subconscious bias, unless I'm willing to admit the times that I've had it, and I've got the thoughts coming in my head. If I want to challenge you about your privileges that you have, or your unearned advantage, whether it's, you know, from being white, being rich, being male, being straight, being Christian, being able-bodied, whatever it is, I can't just point at you and say, you're privileged. You need to check your privilege. We all have some form of privilege. Everybody in this room has got some area where we are the quote-unquote norm, where we're the dominant group. And my thing is, I just want people to think, when you're the dominant group, one thing I know about you is you have the luxury of missing some things. You have the luxury of being oblivious to some things. It isn't just about white people. It's not just about white men. It's not just about straight white men. It's not just about straight white Christian men. Everybody in here, if you're able-bodied, you have privilege, you don't have to think about the stuff people with disabilities face. If you're straight or cisgender, you don't have to think about what LGBTQ folks face. You know, and so all of us have an area, maybe several areas, and I just want us to start with that. Let's start with where we are when we're trying to get somebody else in the conversation rather than starting where they are. Because that's what makes people defensive, understandably. They feel judged. This isn't about judgment. Good people can find themselves in bad systems. And when you're a good person, you find yourself in bad systems, that system can corrupt even the best person, right? That can be true of a teacher, can be true of an employer, can be true of a law enforcement official, can be true of a politician, can be true of a banker. Right? I think most people get into all of those jobs for the right reason, but if you get into a system that is predicated on maintaining certain systems in place and certain, you know, dynamics in place, it can change you more than you can change it if you're not aware of it. Yes?
Thank you.
Yeah.
As a historian who works very closely with sociologists and social workers on a day-to-day basis, this mesh idea, which is brilliant, and I'm hoping I will sign your name to it, but I am
Thank you.
At an institutional level, do you have advice on how to push through sometimes institutional, administrative, economic, whatever barrier we want to name it, challenges to a singular focus, almost tunnel vision sometimes it seems, on a STEM initiative to push forward towards more of a mesh?
Well, I think I don't know that I have a way to, I've just literally been thinking about this for a sort of short period of time, but I think that as I conceptualize it, I think if we make clear, first we have to ask a basic question, which is, what is the purpose of education? Okay? If the purpose of education in our mind is to simply prepare people for the jobs of tomorrow, well, I call that trade school, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with trade school. But that to me is not what a university exists for. It's not what typical colleges exist for. It's not what liberal arts exists for. It's not what the broader apparatus of education exists for. It's not just job training, right? And so if we're doing STEM single-mindedly, it seems to me that's what we're saying, is that this is about the jobs of tomorrow. Well, first of all, that's some of the jobs of tomorrow. You know what some of the other jobs of tomorrow are? Retail, and low-paid nursing assistant jobs, and working in elder homes, elder care facilities, right? One of the biggest areas right now that's of job growth is not STEM, it's nursing home, elder care. One of the reasons the economy stays strong, regardless of who the president is, by the way, Democrat or Republican, is because the jobs that are being created have to do with taking care of old folks, right? And when you have an aging population, which we do, we have an aging population, rapidly aging, you're going to have a lot of sick people, so you're going to create a lot of healthcare jobs. Actually, you're not going to create any of them. Like, the president doesn't create jobs, newsflash, right? That's not actually how this works. But every president takes credit, Democrat or Republican, even though it's not really usually anything they're doing. In this particular case, we've got a lot of healthcare jobs being created because we've got a lot of old people and they need healthcare, and people are hired to take care of it. And a lot of times not paid very well. But hopefully we're not going to do STEM plus low-paid nursing. Right? That's not what we're trying to do, is prepare people for low-paid nursing jobs. No. So the idea that we're going to focus on things that are about the job market seems to me a little single-minded in a dangerous way. But the other piece of it is, if we recognize that the function of education ought to be the creation of informed citizens, right, who can maintain a society, because right now we're incredibly divided, obviously, as a society, to the point where we're sort of all in our silos and we all sort of just read the news that we want to read, and we can't really speak to each other about things. And they're saying that dating apps now, people are like swiping or whatever. I don't know right or left. I'm married, I'm not supposed to know. But whatever the swiping left or right thing, whatever the one is that you're passing on somebody, people are passing just on politics, which I don't blame you. I would probably do that too, but it just goes to show that we're very deeply divided. So we need to figure out how to maintain a pluralistic, multicultural democracy in which all can function and flourish. And STEM can't do that. What STEM can do is it can maybe fix our infrastructure. Okay, that's good. Maybe it can avert ecological catastrophe, very necessary, very good. But if we avert ecological catastrophe only to lose what makes our culture and our society ostensibly special, then robots can do that. Do we really? Is that what we want? We just want a society where the robots do everything. We need to have a functioning society, and that's going to mean engaging us around these other issues. And like I said, I think if we talk to educators and school boards and principals and teachers and lawmakers who make education policy in a way that connects the STEM to the mesh, then it's not about opposition. It's not about saying enough with STEM. No, STEM is important. But STEM is made better by the mesh. STEM is made better if we have an understanding of, for example, how science and technology have been and could be again used in destructive ways. Think about not just past, I talked about the historical examples, but even think about right now with facial recognition technology, all these conversations about how that can be misused. The fact that your Alexa is spying on your ass. I don't know if you know that, but absolutely straight up spying on you. They say they're not, but for real, go home and, tell you what, go home if you have Alexa in the corner and say, call 911 and see just under your breath and see if the ambulance doesn't show up. Because they can hear everything, right? So if you don't want to be heard, you better unplug Alexa, is what I'm trying to tell you. There are now ways of, your microphone can detect on your computer things that you're talking about. I don't know if you know this or not, you can turn that off, by the way, in your settings, but your microphone, so I don't know if you ever had the phenomena of you'll be talking about something, and then you will get an ad, like an hour later, about the very thing that you were talking about. My mom came to me and she's like, Dad, how did this happen? I'm like, I don't know, it freaked me out. And then I looked it up. Oh, okay, this technology actually can hear you speaking, right, on certain websites or on certain apps, and then all of a sudden you're talking about going to the Bahamas, and it's like Bahamas will just come up. Well, that's freaky. You're talking about, we need a new mattress, and all of a sudden Casper mattress ads pop up. Right? So these are sociological questions. These are ethical questions, right? We can't answer them just with the technology. We need the technology for certain things, but we have to have a conversation about artificial intelligence. We have to have a conversation about, maybe there is a conversation to be had, for instance, about whether some work should be done by robots and it can free people for more leisure time and it can free people to do volunteer work. And that's not a bad idea, but that's an ethical discussion. And it's one that you can't have just from a scientific perspective. All the science discussion there is this feasible? The question of whether something is feasible says nothing about whether it's a good idea, right? And so we have to have that conversation, yes?
So, you talked about like looking internally as we begin to like look at our biases and privileges. And then earlier this morning, you kind of talked about like how we have it made up in our mind of black folks feel a certain kind of way about this way and white folks feel a certain kind of this way. How do we begin to have that conversation knowing what we know? Right, like we talked about earlier, like the racism piece, like I know that you're a racist. I mean, I know you personally, but in my mind, I've been conditioned to think that because whatever has happened to me. But how do we begin to have that conversation by removing those biases?
Well, I'm not totally sure that I'm going to answer the question correctly, but I'll take a stab at it. I don't think that we can remove biases entirely, maybe ever. I know we can't remove them unless we acknowledge them. And if we acknowledge them, we might stand a fighting chance. So the first piece of all of that, I think, is you have to own the fact that advertising works, right? So let me tell you what I mean by that. So Super Bowl just happens. Companies take out all those ads, hundreds of millions of dollars spent. Not because they just had extra money to blow, but because they want to sell you stuff. They want you to buy their products. And the research in the field of marketing says that after about 12 times of seeing an ad, that's the point where you become exponentially more likely to purchase the product. So the first handful of times, you might not even know what the product was. You're like me, you've seen ads, you're like, I don't even know what that was. It was a horrible advertisement. Yeah, but here's the thing. Next time it comes on, you're going to pay very close attention, aren't you? Because you didn't catch it the first time. So now that's your number 4 or your number 5. And you get to number 8 and 9, all of a sudden you're showing interest in this thing. You hit 12 and you're like, oh my God, I gotta go get a Taco Bell breakfast burrito crunch wrap. You didn't really want that. You never lobbied for that. You never wrote a letter to Taco Bell and said, you know what I want at 6:30 in the morning is a taco wrapped up in a burrito with some egg and sausage in it. Can y'all make that happen? Like nobody was clamoring for that. But somebody at Taco Bell was like, watch this. They made the product, they advertised it, all of a sudden people are lined up for it because they saw the ad. So if you can make somebody switch sneakers, switch toothpaste, switch toilet paper, switch smartphones, by really good, clever advertising, think about how much easier it is to teach racial bias, religious bias, gender, class bias, because you've seen that ad more than 12 times, right? Like figuratively speaking, right? Not a real ad, but you've seen, you know this difference. So first is you just gotta acknowledge it. You just have to be willing to own the fact that it's part of who you are. Now, it doesn't have to be the controlling part of who you are, right? It's like the good and evil piece. It's like the violent and altruistic piece. One of those is going to win today. And we have some level of control, hopefully, over which one of those sides wins. But the only way is you have to acknowledge that that poison is in there. Just like I had to acknowledge my grandmother. That poison stayed in her for all those years, and she could fight it, you know? She could resist it as long as she was healthy. But once she was no longer healthy is when it reasserted itself. So we just all have to be on guard against that. It's a very humbling thing, right? It's very humbling to acknowledge how easily you can get played by your conditioning. And here's the good thing. If you know that, then you can actually take steps to minimize the extent to which you act on the conditioning. So for instance, when I'm going to the grocery, right, what do they always tell you? Never go to the grocery what? Hungry, right? Because you'll buy stuff you don't need, impulse purchasing, right? So that's why they put all the chocolate at the checkout, right? You do know that. That's not an accident. It's not like the guy that orders the chocolate ordered too much and he just did it every month forever. And he just keeps ordering. He's like, ah, gosh, I keep ordering too much chocolate. What should we do with it? We got a whole aisle of chocolate. What do we do with the overflow? Oh, I don't know. Let's put it up where they pay. Like it's not coincidence. It's not an accident, right? That's why they put it there. And because they know people are going to go to the grocery hungry, and then they're going to buy stuff you don't need. So if you don't go to the grocery hungry, right, you eat before you go, you consciously think, I'm not going to do this, then, but the only way you can do that is if you recognize that you are being manipulated, right? If you recognize the manipulation, you can say, I'm not going to let this happen today. And you can take steps, but you have to own it, right? So number one is that. That's also very humbling because it means that you can't really draw a line down the middle of the road and say, these are the good people over here, these are the bad people, right? Because there are no good and bad people, it's just people. in a society that has taught them a whole bunch of nonsense about a whole lot of people, based on race, religion, sexuality, gender, class, all of these things. And so if we stop dividing us into the good and the bad, I think most people are a combination of those, and it's about which one's winning today and which one's winning tomorrow. Very few people are just purely antisocial or sociopathic. There are some, right? But most people are not. Most people are pretty good folks trying to do the right thing most of the time, trying not to hurt each other. But if you find yourself in a bad system, you can be, as I said, you can be warped. So you have to own that piece, right? You have to own the way that systems can change you. Think about if you're a teacher. I think very few people go into teaching who are overtly racist, right? Or overtly hateful. Some do, and I've known some. But I don't think most people do. But I think the problem is if you're in a society that says the high-achieving kids are just smarter and the low-achieving kids have something wrong with them, and then you notice that has a racial dynamic to it, you start judging those on the bottom. And not just white teachers, by the way. Even teachers of color will sometimes engage in that and speak in a much harsher way and treat their children of color much more harshly. So we're all being susceptible to it, and I think owning that will allow us to have the conversation across lines of race and identity without the same level of acrimony and judgment. So I would start with that.
I just wanted to go back to your mission, because I think that part of the challenge, and something that might be even more fundamental to what you're asking, is that part of the challenge is that we end up looking and processing everything through the lens of economics. And when you look at that idea, you're asking, what is the purpose of education? But I mean, the point just becomes, at some point, what do we value? I mean, and because any idea that we go for ultimately turn it into so when you ask me about education, you still got to get underneath that and just say, what is it that we value? Right? Because that just affects the picture, right?
Right. I mean, on the one hand, look, I get it. Like, yes, if I'm struggling, part of why I'm probably going to school is so I won't struggle as much, of course. So yes, I'm trying to get a better job than maybe my parents had, and trying my kids to do better than I did. And education is one way to that, but that doesn't make that the point of education. That makes that a benefit of education, right? That becomes a thing for which education can be helpful. That's not why I'm going. Because really and truly, like the richest people on the planet, a lot of them didn't go to college. So if it's just about making money, why? Like just go learn to code, make some apps, come up with some new product, whatever, you'll be richer. I mean, that's really the purpose, but that's not why we go. And what's funny is, back in the day, we knew this. So, 100 years ago, we know that, first of all, we had a time when higher education was more or less off limits, particularly elite higher education, off limits to most people unless they were white, male, Christian, Protestant, East Coast, rich family, right? That's who went to the Ivy League. And nobody in those days said the purpose of going to the Ivy League schools is so you can get a really good job and you were set. Like you were gonna have a job, it was gonna be all right. You didn't have to do that as some form of upward mobility. The purpose of education was to teach you how to think. It was to value the life of the mind. It was to learn how to think. Philosophy was a very big piece of it. You could go and get gentleman's C's at Harvard and Princeton and Yale, like a lot of these rich white men did, and you'd still be a lawyer, you'd still be a doctor, you'd still be the president, you'd still be whatever. No, for real. You could do that at Yale or Ford, all good. But the thing is that when all of a sudden working class people began to try to access higher education, and when people of color began to really, in large numbers, access it, and when desegregation came in, and it challenged sort of that traditional hierarchy, then that's when all of a sudden we didn't want to just teach people how to think anymore. And we tried to make it this altruistic thing about just trying to help them get jobs, but A, it didn't really help them get very many good jobs, right? They still were on the bottom of the labor market, hierarchy. And then secondly, you have to ask yourself, why don't you want working class people and marginalized people to learn how to think? Like, why is that a good skill for rich people, but not a good skill for poor people? It seems like that's a really good skill for all people. We just want to teach poor people what to think. Right? So we just want to teach them these skills, teach them how to balance a checkbook, teach them how to listen to the boss, teach them how to respect authority, and then send them out in the world to work. If we taught them how to think, though, just like we teach rich people how to, because nobody knows how to think right away. I mean, you just do it, but you don't know how to think critically. You have to be taught that, whether you're rich, middle class, poor, whatever you are. We don't want poor people thinking critically, because then they'll assess those systems that they're in and they'll challenge them, right? So we don't want to do that. We don't want to have people of color thinking critically about those systems, because then they'll be more likely to challenge them. So the purpose for which education was created for those people at the top, actually pretty good idea for everybody. But it's just that we don't, not only do we not believe in it, we say things like, well, that won't work with those kids, right? How many times have we heard something like that? Like, you know, well, you can't do that in those schools. It works in the prep schools, and it works in the charter schools, not even the charter schools. It works in the private academies, and it works in the really wealthy public schools, but you can't do that, you know, in the quote unquote urban school system. You just can't. So like my kid, you know, when she started kindergarten, my oldest child, I mean, it was a multiracial class, but it was definitely middle class and above, and upper middle probably disproportionate. And the teacher sat them down and had them, first day of kindergarten, create the rules for the class, right? What should our rules be? And what should be the punishment, or not, she didn't use the word punishment, she said, what should the consequences be for somebody who violates those rules? Now, how often do you think in low-income communities, even white ones, but especially low-income communities of color, that kindergarten teachers are just turning over control of the rulemaking to the 5-year-olds? That just is not happening, hardly ever. There might be a handful of teachers that do it, but most of the time not, because there's a fear of, well, first of all, they can't handle it. You just can't do that here. Why can't I? Why? Because the thing is that kids are sort of smart. They're pretty smart at 5. They can come up with some really, now some of the rules are silly, like ice cream every day at 10, right? But the other, you know, kids are going to come up with some nonsense too. But they'll also come up with some really good ones, and then they'll come up with the consequences, and the consequences for violating the rules are amazing that kids come up with. They're usually rooted in restorative justice principles, right? This idea that we want to reintegrate that person back into the group as quickly as possible, have them make amends to the person that they hurt. Because at 5 or 6, you're still willing to say you're sorry, see? Right? At that age, you're still willing to, and you know the value of saying you're sorry. It's when you get older, you don't think that you're sorry. Right? So if we can do that with these kids, we can do that with all kids. But here's the problem. Our culture says that not everybody can handle that level of autonomy. Right? And our culture says, I mean, think about it. We're a society that says if you give tax money back to rich people, they'll create jobs and do great things with it. But if you give tax money to poor people, they'll buy crap. Right? So basically, that's an assumption of fundamentally different human natures, right? The incentives that work for these people won't work for these people, because fundamentally they're not really people. That's sort of what we're saying. They just don't operate on the same human emotions that every other human operates, right? And I think at some level, that's something we need to really revisit, right? Why is it that we think we have to make education all about, as you said, economics, and why it is that we can't have the co-creation of our curricular space, the co-creation of our discipline, the co-creation of our classroom instruction, classroom management, and all these things, because those things teach how to live together. Those things teach how to live in a multicultural, pluralistic kind of democracy. Those are life skills that are very important. And they also might actually help on the job for what it's worth, but it's just that that's strategic.
So my question actually relates to younger kids. You had talked about we can't just define success, and I haven't had one, so I just want to quite motivated by this. You can't tell your kid, or you shouldn't tell your kid, hey, you work real hard, you can do whatever you achieve, right? You have to have the asterisk. So do you have a suggested, somewhat concise way to explain to, let's say, a kid under 8, just because they're such formative years, right? So do you have a suggested way to explain to a kid, you have to work hard, but you also have to be lucky, you also have to know the right people, and you also have to be in the right environment?
Right. So I don't know that there's a super easy way, but I'll tell you what I did with my kids. I don't know if it worked out all right. I don't know if it was the best way. But they were my kids, so I figured if I screwed them up, I had years to fix it. So I said one day, we were talking, you know, they always had a sense, I think, that they were very fortunate to be in the home that they're in, with the resources far greater than the ones that I had, far less drama and trauma than either my wife or I experienced growing up. I realize I'm still talking to this because I'm doing something. So I remember one day we were sort of talking about, I don't know if they were under 8, they probably weren't, they're probably 10, so I don't know if this would work pretty well. But we were talking about how, you know, sort of understanding the role of luck privilege and circumstance, because they work really hard, they're very good students, and they're really good dancers, and they work really hard, but I wanted to convey to them how that wasn't sufficient, there was more to it. So I started walking them backwards. We're talking about how I met their mom, and without which meeting they don't exist. And the only way in which I met my wife was, the only reason I met her was because I happened to move back to Nashville at a particular time. If I moved back a couple of days earlier or a couple of days later, I'm probably not going to meet her, because when I moved back, it just so happened there were two women who were advertising for a roommate. They preferred to have a male roommate. They both worked with my wife. So I preferred living with women, because I lived with women as roommates before, and I lived with men as roommates before, and I knew which of those worked better for me. I'm not fastidious, but the guys I lived with were straight up pigs, and I was like, done. My wife doesn't believe this story because she thinks I'm a pig. But in any event, I moved in with these two women, and they worked with my wife, and one of them introduced me to my wife. If I'm a couple days early, a couple days late, they either fill that spot already or I find another place. So I said, isn't that, I told Ashton and Rachel, I said, isn't that nuts? Like, just think of like just the luck. And I'm like, they were like, wow. I said, yeah, but it actually is deeper than that. The only reason I could come home from New Orleans was because I didn't really have a real job. I was writing, and I was out speaking, and I could do that from anywhere. And so I didn't have to go to a particular job, and I had the freedom to make a decision to move, and so I did. If I'd had a regular job, I might have wanted to move, but I might not have been able to. And so then I wouldn't have met your mom, and then, all the way to morning. Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? And I said, but what's really wild is like, why didn't I have a regular job? It's sort of weird. Most your friends most of them have regular jobs. They're like, yeah, how did you pull that off? They were curious. And I said, well, and they knew a little bit about what I did already by that age, as much as an 8-year-old or 6-year-old, 7-year-old could, 10-year-old, whatever it was. And I said, well, the thing is, when I got out of college, I started working in fighting racism, and doing all this civil rights work, and I was, doing work against this guy named David Duke, who was a member of this hate group, and really a horrible person, running for office, and I worked in the campaigns against him, and then that helped me get out on the lecture circuit. I was able to do that for a living, and I said, but what's really wild is the only reason that I got that job was because I knew the two guys that started that organization. One of them was a history professor of mine, one of them was a good friend, and they started this group, and they offered me the gig right out of college. The only reason I knew them was because I'd gone to that school. Like, if I'd gone to any other college, I wouldn't have met them, I wouldn't have gotten that job, I wouldn't have had, therefore, the freedom that came from that job to move back home to Nashville, meet your mom, and ultimately have y'all. This is sort of weird, right? And they're like, yeah. And now they're getting really, now it's getting deep in the weird, right? Because they're just like starting to realize all the pieces that could have gone wrong and made them not be, which is now, it's a little traumatizing. So I don't know if you want to try this with an 8-year-old, but in a year or so it'll work. I said, the thing is, the only reason I went to Tulane, y'all, it's crazy. The reason I went to Tulane, I was chasing a girl that went to Louisiana State. True story. I was chasing a girl who went to LSU and convinced me. She was a debater in Louisiana. I was a debater in Nashville. We met at a summer debate camp in Washington, D.C. in the summer between junior and senior year. And she convinced me that I had to go to Tulane. I was going to go to Emory in Atlanta and debate for them. I was being recruited by the coach there. I was set to go there. Tulane didn't even have a debate team. And I was just like, screw it. I'm 17 and in love. You tell me I got to go to Tulane, I'm going to Tulane. And so she said, you have to, Atlanta's too far from Baton Rouge. You have to go to New Orleans. I said, okay. So it changed my whole life for this young woman. If I don't meet her, though, I don't go to Tulane. I don't end up doing that work against David Duke. I don't end up getting a reputation for doing this work and have the freedom to then move back home in 1996. And the only reason I knew her was because I'd gone to that debate camp. There were a bunch of debate camps I could have gone to. I happened to go to the one at American University. If I go to any other one, not going to meet her. Or if I just wasn't a debater. And you may think, listening to me all this time now, that I was born a debater. debater. You may think that I popped out of my mom's womb arguing about stuff. This is not completely true. But what I was as a child was I was an athlete. I was a jock. I was a baseball player. That was my thing. And I was really pretty good. I was good enough to where I had like college scouts come into my little league games. And I thought that was going to be my path, right? That I was going to go play ball. So I was looking at all, when I was a little kid, I was looking at all these baseball schools, right? I was looking at Texas and Arizona State, and all these schools that I knew were really good in college baseball. I thought that was going to be my path. But the weirdest thing, I looked at my kids and I said, you know, because like with y'all and dance, like dance is your thing, right? And baseball was my thing. I said, this one day I was in high school, and I went and tried out for the high school baseball team, and I had been like one of the best youth baseball players in the city, but I try out for the baseball team in high school, and I get cut. I had the worst tryout ever. It's like I forgot how to play. Couldn't swing the bat, couldn't catch a fly ball, couldn't field a ground ball, couldn't do anything. And I got cut, and I had to find a different activity. I was like, now imagine if y'all were trying out for dancing, you didn't make it all of a sudden, you'd have to find something else, and that would be really hard, right? Yes, and so I did. I found debate. And that's how I met Monica, and that's how I ended up at Tulane, and that's how I ended up getting that job, and later meeting your mom, and you know, the rest of you understand the story. I said, so literally, the only reason y'all exist is because of that jerk that cut me from the baseball. I said, so now do you understand how luck works? And they were like crying now. The lesson was learned because it was just a way of saying, like, literally anything goes different in our lives. And that wasn't even a story about privilege, right? That wasn't a story about systemic inequality. That was just a luck story. But we all have those. Like, it might be that third grade teacher that believed in us when nobody else did. It might be that mentor that came into our life, or some neighbor that, you know, helped us when we needed help. I don't know. We all have that. And so to actually, I think, talk to kids about the random, it's hard, it's scary, because we don't want to think of things, I'm not saying completely random, but we prefer, don't we, to think, well, everything happens for a reason. Like, it's very comforting to say, in relation to that story I just told you, that I was destined to meet my wife. That's very romantic, right? Very romantic. It's also very unlikely, right? That we're just meant to meet certain people. It's incredibly unlikely. Because if you say that it was destiny, well, wait a minute now. If me meeting my wife and having those children was destiny, then that means 2 billion children around the globe that are starving to death is also destiny. Like, at some point, it can't just be some of us and not all of us, right? So if some stuff is destined, other stuff is destined, and I have a really hard time reconciling myself to a universe that says it's destiny that a couple billion people starve to death, right? So I have to actually be willing to let go of my fear of admitting that luck is a thing. The reason we're scared of it, let's be honest, is because if we've had good luck up to now, we could have bad luck next week. Something could go wrong, and we'd rather be the captain of our ship. And we'd rather think we're in total control. But the beauty of it is, when you let go of some of that control, you actually, I think, are healthier, because that control will kill you. Like, part of the thing that we didn't really get into today, but I do a lot of talks about this. One of the reasons that I think we have this opioid crisis, right, that everybody talks about. I mean, think about that. This is an opioid crisis and also a suicide spike, major suicide spike in white, working class, non-college educated, rural and small town communities, right? Massive increase in suicides, massive increase in opioid overdoses and alcohol-related illnesses like cirrhosis of the liver. Now, it happens to other people too, but disproportionately it's been happening to white, working class, non-college educated, middle-aged folks. Why? Why? Well, some people have tried to call these deaths of despair, right? That's the term they use. They say, well, it's because they're in such pain. Yeah, I get that. Yes, many of them are in pain. But people of color, right, still more likely to be unemployed than them, more likely to be poor. Every indicator of social well-being, black and brown folks are still worse off. And yet they're not seeing the same level of suicide spike, the same level of opioid overdose. So there's something, it's not objective pain, right? It's not just objective despair. There must be an intervening factor, right, between the despair and the reaction to the despair. What's the intervening factor? The intervening factor is those white folks who were doing that to themselves believed in the system all these years. And now have come to find out that it was a scam. See, black and brown folks already knew that the system was a scam. So when black and brown folks were simply reminded of something that they had already known, it's just like, yep, that's sort of what I thought. The economy collapses in 2009, double-digit unemployment. Black and brown folks are like, we call that Wednesday. Okay. White folks are like, that hasn't happened since the Great Depression, and it was my grandfather's generation, and we don't know how to cope with it. So it's not just despair and pain, it's that we're in pain, and we were told that we weren't in pain. We were told that we played by the rules, we did everything right, we kept our nose clean, we kept our head down, we worked hard, it would work out for us. Black and brown folks always knew it was more complicated. But many of us had the luxury of believing it, and now we're finding out, oh, the jobs have gone overseas, the economy's globalized, the plant closed down, you know, our kids are leaving this town, the town's dying, right? Like, we weren't prepared for that setback, and you know what made it worse? That notion of rugged individualism. That notion of, because think about it, if I'm that working class white dude, and I'm 55 years old, and I've been working at the so-and-so plant for years and years and years, and the boss decides to send this plant overseas to take advantage of lower wages, and, you know, crappier union protections and all that. And now I'm out of work. And I'm 10 years from retirement, roughly, right? And nobody will hire me now because it costs too much. Because if they have to pay into my health care, it's too expensive. They'd rather get somebody who's 27 and train them, and they're not going to cost them as much. So I can't find a new job. Now, if I was a person of color, I would already know, like, that kind of stuff happens, and it sucks, and we got to figure out a way to get through it. But if I'm a white man in this country, even working class, and I had a good working class blue collar job all those years, that wasn't supposed to happen to me. And when it does, you know what? I can sit there and I can blame immigrants, and I will, and I can blame black folks, and I will, and I can blame whoever I want to blame, but there's a voice in the back of my head. There is a voice in the back of my head. It is telling me, it's you. You should work harder. You should go out and, that's what we told them. We said, go get a job. When the plant closed, what did we tell people of color? Move where the jobs are. We didn't say, oh, we'll bring the jobs back to your urban communities where the manufacturing plants closed. No, we said, y'all need to get up and go. But then these folks are like, no, bring the jobs back to me. Why? Because there's that voice in their head that tells them that they're somehow to blame for their own condition, and they don't want to face that. So I think we've actually set ourselves up. And I think part of debunking that is that it frees you so that when you do struggle, and we all are going to struggle, right? Life is painful, right? Life is tragic, as James Baldwin said. And part of why it's tragic is that we're always hurtling toward the grave from the moment we're born. There's tragedy in life, man. That's just how it is. So if I'm willing to embrace that truth and recognize that life is that way, then I can free myself for those moments when I'm struggling. It might be a job loss. It might be financial struggle. It might be health struggle. It might be a relationship that falls apart, right? Whatever the struggle you're going through is, if you've learned that it's not always about you. Yeah, you may be the agent of your own healing in part. You may have to do some stuff to get to that next place. I'm not saying that it's all outside of your control, but if you at least relinquish the blame, the self-blame that says I'm to blame. Like when I started therapy and I got to the point where it's like, yeah, I've done some wrong things in my life, and I have treated people incorrectly in my life, and I have to take accountability for it. I have to take responsibility for it, but I also need to know when's the behavior, right? Where did that come from? And once I got clear on where it came from, it freed me to not beat myself up all the time. And I didn't have to stay in shame all the time, right? Because I think one of the reasons that we stay divided racially is it has to do with shame. I think you have people in the dominant group who feel shame that they're not doing better, and if the only way that I can release my shame is by shaming you and saying, well, your community doesn't work hard enough. Your community is the bad community, and I don't have to deal with my own shame. So a lot of this, you know, maybe I need to figure out a way to add a P to that mesh. I don't know how to work it, but the psychology piece, right? Like, because there's a psychological element to this too, as well as sociology, but the P doesn't work with mesh, so I don't know. You all have to come up with a new acronym. But I do think that it's actually helpful if we teach our young people, yeah, look, working hard is rewarding. Like when my girls go out and dance and they bust their ass and they practice and they work hard, you know, are the odds better that they're going to do well if they practice more? Absolutely. The oldest is, you know, applying to colleges right now. She's already been accepted at a couple of programs and DFA programs at really good dance school. That probably wouldn't have happened if she hadn't practiced and worked hard. But it's still important for me to let her know, hey, look, you know what? If you're going to be a dancer, if that's your path, you know, there's going to be struggle. It's one of the reasons we're not going to let you take out $100,000 in student loan debt to be a dancer in New York City. You have to start out with considerably less debt than that, right? But when you do struggle,
I want you to be able to push through that, and I want you to think about how collectively you get together with other people to push through, rather than taking it all on yourself. A couple of last questions, real quick, maybe one real quick, and we'll let you have it. Yes.
Okay, so, so I would tell you our biggest issue is trying to fight what we are currently in. We have, we've been in a shelter and not because of DV or eviction.
Right.
And because we came back from another state, there has been this really crazy time. I'm an education fanatic as far as, I'm not a student choice fanatic, but I understand on all sides. And I e-schooled my daughters. I transferred here, and it's a hybrid school. And so in the shelter, so even though I know we have rights, which has worked for us for 5 years, right? And my daughters are learning 2 languages, even still in this shelter, and it is hard, right? It is hard to, when they are fighting you, they know that your kids are smart, but they want the negotiation. I refuse to put them in, as far as I will put you in lower housing, but we'll put your kids in private school so it'll make us look good. To the point where multiple times, if I did not respond the way, then we'll kick you out. And I told the director in his place on January the 9th, the day before my babies got sick with all that mess that was going around, I said, don't you understand that I know what corporate social responsibility is? It's a nice way of branding and marketing. I'm living in a whole sociology exhibit and experiment in this whole building, and he looked at me. I said, I don't understand why you still want these stereotypes to be in the shelter. You don't think my girls are understanding what you're doing? And to tell them, like, we miss out, we are really arts and culture people. Even for us being here after 4, I know I'm probably getting in trouble, but I really don't care, because you're not gonna stop me from what I know needs to be done. Then we just got an organization that said, we'll help you with housing, but you gotta ditch school, and there's no way you can do a double major, because if you're in this position, you can't do that. And these are grown people telling me that around my age. I am 41. How do you keep fighting through that? Because I am tired. Even my daughter was like, Mama, your eyes are touching purple. I said, I have sleep deprivation. Because I'm like, I know this is the path I'm supposed to be on. But the fight going through it, to fight that every single week and every day, and just, to keep them exposed to other things. I can't be like the stereotypes that they want to have running around and cussing everybody out. I'm saying nobody does it in the wealthy. You may have heard something more in some of the wealthier families, but it is really that, and it's in there. And so when we have to go places at night with this shelter, I get, your kids are so respectful, and at first I was thinking, well, that's nice, but actually that's like a horrible compliment, because the expectation is that all black kids act a fool, and I'm like, nah, that's not cool. It's the way it was said. It was not how. And so how do you keep fighting without your spirit just being gone? Because I was listening to you, and I'm like, Lord, He's telling us everything that's been happening to us since the 19th.
First of all, thank you for coming. And I'll tell you, although I obviously I can't directly, based on firsthand experience, tell you how you keep fighting against those odds that you face, but I will tell you this. I would imagine that whatever spirit-crushing, soul-crushing reality it can be to have to constantly fight like that and still run up against the same nonsense. And that can be spirit-crushing, I'm sure. I can only imagine that it would crush your spirit more to not fight the way you would fight for your children. So at the risk of being not particularly helpful, but still maybe in a way helpful, I would say you keep doing exactly what you do, because not only is it setting an incredible example for your children, but it's also, whether it happens right away or not, I don't know, but when people in those positions of authority see someone who refuses to back down, who refuses to go away, who refuses to just play nice and sort of take it, right? It can begin to affect their consciousness, what they're used to. Let's be honest. What they're used to in most social service agencies of one type or another is the same thing that customer service reps are used to when you call to try to argue about a healthcare thing that was turned down, right? Like a claim that was denied by your insurance company. Their goal is just wear you down, right? Their goal is we just keep denying this and keep transferring you to this number and eventually you'll just give up, right? Social service agencies often operate that way, which is well-intended people. I mean, most of them decent people, but at the end of the day, when you're trying to serve hundreds of people, or maybe several thousand people in a various community, you get to the point where you take it as your job almost to just get this person sort of off my doorstep, right? And so the best thing that you can do is to, it's not that it's a good choice, because like you said, it's exhausting, and you end up sleep deprived, but you're setting an example not only within your own family, but for them as well, and possibly even for other people in the same position who are seeing your response, who are seeing how you're dealing with the situation, and that may affect how they deal with the situation. Now, there may be, I don't want to make this point, and then we'll be done, because they've now opened up the thing, and I know it's going well with it. But there may be folks in this room who can also connect, and I think, Brandon, that may be what you're waiting at right now. Yes, Brandon's going to come talk to you in a second. A dear friend of mine who is an educator and now works with an organization about 6 blocks from here may be able to connect with you around some of that. If anybody else in the room has some ideas, some thoughts, please.
My name is Gigi Brown, so I'll come over to you as soon as we break up, and we'll talk.
And thank you again for your time. Very important.